Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. So it had been a very busy Black Friday at the 7-Eleven. Now, we don't usually even do specific Black Friday deals. This was 2019, and we'd done that bring your own cup deal the year before, and plenty of people had arrived with cups for infinite refills this year too, and we had to explain our store wasn't doing that promotion this year. Like every store, we had certain things on discount, but nothing really worth getting excited over. Now, despite that, from how busy the damn store had been, you'd have thought that we were giving Doritos and Mountain Dew away for free. I'd taken the shift thinking that it couldn't possibly be that stressful. I've worked retail at Target and Best Buy on Black Friday, and holy God, I'd rather drop a 60-inch TV on my head than do that again. This really happened to a customer, by the way. Anyway, that's not the point of the story. The point is that I've been rushed non-stop on my feet, and it wasn't until around 4 a.m. or so that I finally had a break where the store was at its usual, basically empty late-night state. And basically what I'm saying is that I was so busy, so rushed, that I have an excuse for failing to lock the back door when I'd taken out some of the cardboard earlier. I should have been more careful, but I wasn't expecting the store to be so busy with only me, Bugs, and January, this chick that I've been crushing on, managing the store. And so yeah, I left the back door open, and you know when I said that the store was finally empty at 4 a.m. or so? Well, it wasn't. You see, a seemingly unhoused individual had snuck his way in through the back door and was camped out in the small storeroom, helping himself to as many non-perishable goods as he could fit in his damn face. And by the time my coworker January had stumbled across him after she went back there to restock the Cheetos, half the guy's face was blue from talkie dust. Now, she called me in immediately and I rushed in to play hero. This guy had been hungry, but not for anything healthy. He'd been tucking into some Twinkies and jerky and Takis and so much junk food that it makes me sick just thinking about it. And my God, he had been necking so many warm cans of Red Bull and Monster Energy. He was a big guy, and he'd stripped off his winter coat and sweater, and at this point, he was just wearing shorts and a dirty white vest. Now, based on the little nest that he'd made for himself in the corner of the storage room, I think he'd been planning on actually bedding down for the night there. Now, I was a little taken aback, but all I could really say was, "Hey buddy, you know you gotta pay for that." And the guy just looked up at me and blinked, and I swear to God, I could see the moment it dawned on him that this stuff wasn't just free, and he was gonna be responsible for the cost. Now, I felt a little bad for him because he clearly seemed to be homeless and very destitute and probably on drugs, even if he was colossally fat and eating junk food. But I still hated to be the one to tell this guy, who was obviously down on his luck, that he was liable for pretty much hundreds of dollars worth of snacks. However, then he stands up, and that talkie dust was flying everywhere, and he points this big chubby finger at me and says, "And how the hell do you expect me to explain this to my wife?" Now, once again, I'm a bit taken back. The dude's walked in and just sort of helped himself to our stock, and now I'm being angrily asked how he's going to tell his wife. I don't know, man. Maybe you shouldn't have eaten our snacks in the first place, I thought. And that's kind of what I say, only in a more tactful way, and then he starts screaming at me that if I hadn't wanted him to eat the chips, I shouldn't have left the door open as an invitation. I guess he kind of had a point. I shouldn't have left the back door open, but if you see someone's house is open, you just don't go in and start eating their food, do you? And I said this to him, and he thought about this for a moment like the answer might have even been yes. And then this guy says, "You're not calling the cops, and you're not calling my wife." So I say, "Okay, we can avoid all that if you can pay for all the items you've eaten, and then we can just sort of make things work." Unfortunately, this guy said that this wasn't going to work for him. He needed to find a solution where the cops and his wife wouldn't get involved, but he wouldn't be stuck with the bill. I asked him what he proposed, and he gave a few ideas. 1, we made them the winner of our Black Friday sweepstakes, which is not a thing. 2, I go halves with him and pay for half the food, and then he could just about manage the rest. Obviously no. And then his final offer was that he would pay for all the food he'd eaten as long as January would do a full striptease for him first. Having the crush that I did on Jan and not being able to hold back on white knighting, I told the dude exactly where he could shove his Takis before instructing Jan to call the cops and let our other coworker Bugs know what was going on. Jan gave me this look that made me think that my white knighting may have gone down well, so I was feeling pretty cool in that moment when I faced down Mr. Taki Man. Now I figured that we'd have an argument for a while until the cops showed up or Bugs came to see what was going on. Instead, all 300 plus pounds of Taki Man came barreling at me with a speed I would never have expected from a man of his size. It was like Big the Cat had fused with Sonic and gotten all 7 Chaos Emeralds. And congrats if you're autistic enough to get that joke. No, I'm not a small guy, but I'm not big either. I'm pretty average in every way, wink wink. Now anyway, distraction aside, I'm not big or tough enough to take the full brunt of being slammed into by this Taki Man's considerable bulk. His hefty stomach bounced me to one side, and I just went tumbling into a pile of Charmin's toilet paper. It could have been worse, I suppose. So then Taki Man bursts out of the door of the storeroom with me scrambling after him. I hear Jan screaming something, and then this huge crash that sounded like the sound of a body slamming headfirst into a now locked back door. It sounded like that because that's exactly what it was. This guy had tried to flee the way he'd come, but he didn't count on the fact that Bugs had locked the back door while Jan was calling the cops, and so Taki Man had charged headfirst into what he believed to be an open door, only to be sent flying backwards into a choke slam by the most jacked, roided biker of a coworker that I'd ever had the pleasure to work with. Now, I have no idea why we called him Bugs, but he was an absolutely huge, muscular guy who was able to choke slam this homeless dude to the ground and then pin him in place until the cops arrived. The 3 of us got into a bit of trouble for leaving the back door unlocked, but there was no camera footage showing who had failed to lock the back door, and we all agreed to keep that bit of information to ourselves, so the worst we had to deal with was just some lecture from the area manager about mindfulness and safety. Now, the Taki Man had faced some weird charges. He avoided a breaking and entering charge due to the back door being unlocked, and despite the sheer volume of what he'd eaten, and the fact that he'd eaten it on the premises, it was dropped to a shoplifting charge which led to a fine and a suspended sentence. Oh, and remember how I said he appeared to be unhoused? The dude was married with a wife and kids. I feel bad for him in a way. He seemed to be suffering from insomnia and some sort of mental health issues due to the stress from his job, and had started taking Ambien, and it was kind of decided that the Ambien was making him act a little crazy, and I'm not sure though. And I'm not sure I can really blame the Ambien either. I think the guy may have just been hungry for Takis. So to start off, my family's generally conservative. We're not like super big on politics or make it our identity or whatever, but if you had to ask, yeah, we kind of sway that way. And the only member of our family who takes it a lot further is my uncle, who's my mom's sister's husband. He was a card-carrying, red hat-wearing MAGA guy with the bumper stickers and everything. He's pulled away from this a bit now after all this stuff with the list, but we're not going to get into that. Now the point is, my uncle is a card-carrying devout Republican and most importantly, a member of the NRA and an absolutely huge gun nut, and I say that respectfully. Now family Thanksgiving is normally fairly chill. My uncle might be one of the most zealous of us all, but he's also a very super respectful dude, and we're not the type of family who get into political arguments. Even with my sister, who is a lot more left-leaning, we have our differences, but we're a loving family, and I generally think that we, including my uncle, are all good people. And I could tell that there was going to be trouble at Thanksgiving in 2023 when my sister showed up with her new boyfriend. Now, for starters, you could see that he had a sort of effect on her. She'd done that whole blue and pink hair thing, which even she had always gently mocked. But I know my sister well, and she kept shooting me these looks of like, I'm sorry about this, and had a kind of nervous disposition. Anyone else might have assumed that she was just referring to her weird new look, but we're twins, and I knew that she meant something else, and that something else was her boyfriend. Now I'm just going to call him Jack, short for Jackass. And right from the beginning, Jack was on the offensive. You could just tell. He was very snippy and coldly polite with my parents, which put me on the defensive immediately, and the same with other family members. After the food was dished out and he announced that he was vegan, something that we had not been informed of at any point, despite Mom sending the usual email out to any family members who might be bringing guests asking if there were any dietary requirements. And so Jack made this big fuss about being vegan, and my mom, bless her, went into the kitchen and went through all the damn boxes of ingredients to work out which food would be safe for him to eat as a vegan, as if it was some peanut allergy or something, while the rest of us all waited to get tucked in. Now, Mom came back with this beautiful handwritten list of foods that were definitely vegan-friendly and handed it to Jack. I saw the list, and there was certainly enough food on there to have a decent meal. Jack looked it up and down, sort of sneered, and remarked that he'd starve if he only ate the vegan dishes, and so he guessed that he'd have to make an exception this time around. Now, you're probably thinking that he just dished up a vegetarian platter, not vegan. No. This guy piled up turkey, ham, pigs in blankets, everything else the rest of us ate onto his plate, and I watched him eat. He went into that meat in a way that made me certain that this man had never been a vegan in his entire goddamn life. What was the effing point? And I kept glancing at my sister, and she just kept flushing with embarrassment. And so we're about 2/3 through the main course, and it's been going surprisingly well, mostly thanks to Jack stuffing his face with turkey so he didn't have room to speak. And we'd just been talking about regular things. I think everyone at the table, especially Uncle Ron, knew to avoid any kind of political discussions. And then finally, Jack took a break from stuffing his face with meat and dairy and made the quip. And it went something like this. He pointed out the front window towards my uncle's truck, which, if you remember, was very magnified back then, and then said, "Nice truck I saw in the driveway. Didn't know Mitt Romney was here." Mitt Romney. Out of literally any Republican you could have picked for the joke, he chose Mitt freaking Romney. And we all just sort of looked at each other like, is this guy trolling? But my sister shot me this look saying, no, please just let it go. And that's when I started to worry. Was this guy maybe a bit unhinged? Now my uncle, God bless him, paused for a second, and I saw his neck turn red with anger for the briefest of moments. And then he just laughed and said something like, Mitt Romney. Come on, son. You could have at least gone for someone cool like Hulk Hogan. So then Jack says, well, I don't think being a MAGA is very cool in any way, and then started talking about women's rights and Roe versus Wade, something which I would note most of my family did not support being repealed, and my sister put her hand on Jack's arm and just asked him to drop it, and he shrugs it off, a bit too violently for my taste, and my sister, who's normally very bubbly and chattily, just sort of falls silent. Now, I've got it in my head that this absolute chuckle frick is maybe an abusive partner, and so I give my uncle the look. He knows the one. It's the look I give him when I'm saying, hey, Uncle Ron, me and you are gonna screw with this guy, okay? And so Ron starts asking me how the shooting's been going, whether I've been hitting my goals at the range, and when we're gonna go out hunting again together. You know, completely innocuous things that would only rile someone up who's gonna have a problem with guns. And of course, Jack immediately leaps on this. He starts ranting about gun culture and this and that, and then he says, of course, it's sick just how anyone can own a gun these days despite obvious mental instability, and clearly looks at Uncle Ron when he says this. Now, Uncle Ron knows that we're trolling this guy, so instead of getting mad, he just ignores Jack and starts telling me all about the new firearms he's purchased recently. It was hilarious. And at one point, he was just completely making up guns that don't even exist, and also claimed to own a military-grade railgun that required a train track to move. At no point did Jack call him out on any of this or call BS, just as we suspected. Instead, he starts going on about how concealed carry should be abolished in our state, and if someone like Uncle Ron should be allowed to own, and it was some gun from Star Wars that Uncle Ron had claimed to own, I forget the name, and that he should at least be forced to let everyone know that he was carrying. Uncle Ron just very calmly smiled and said something like, "Nah, son, if I'm gonna protect myself with a firearm, then I hardly want the bad guy to see me coming." Now, Jack just got furious about this, and I'm not gonna type out the whole damn argument, but it led to Uncle Ron losing his cool, and they got into a full-blown screaming match about politics and Trump and Kamala, and the rest of us just sort of sat there looking at each other like this is the worst Thanksgiving ever. And so then Jack gets so angry that he leaps up from the table, knocking his chair backwards. My sister again reaches out to touch his arm and calm him down, and this time he actually shoves her away. So now, of course, Uncle Ron jumps up too, and he starts screaming at Jack like he's a pathetic, weak little man and blah, blah, blah. And that's when Jack reaches into his cardigan, pulls out the pistol that he's been concealed carrying for this entire Thanksgiving meal. Everyone just sort of freezes, falling silent. Uncle Ron stares back at Jack, and a look of peace and calm falls over his face. Because despite being the biggest gun nut I know, Uncle Ron is clearly not carrying at a family Thanksgiving dinner. And so here he is, face down with a supposed anti-gun vegan meat eater who's now pointing a gun at him. And Ron just says, "You don't want to do this, son. You don't want to throw your life away over some old man's political opinions. This isn't you, etc., etc." And he really started trying to convince Jack that he was a good person, that he was better than this, time to prove it, etc. And Jack had the absolute gall to say that Ron was right. He was better than all of us, and he'd prove it by lowering his gun. And that's when something unexpected happened. From behind Jack, a huge vase came flying towards his head and exploded as it smashed against his skull. Jack then fell, tripping over the fallen chair, and the gun flew out of his hand and landed on the ground, and I quickly went for it. Now looking up, I saw my sister standing there, breathing hard, and this absolute look of fury on her face. Now as I looked at the gun in my hand, I realized what she'd clearly noticed, which she went on to explain. Jack, the idiot that he was, hadn't taken the safety off his pistol. He clearly had no idea how to use it, so rather than trust him to actually lower the gun, and just in case he suddenly realized the safety was on and reacted differently, my sister decided to just brain him with the vase that we'd inherited from our great Nana, and I think the old woman would have approved. Now anyway, my sister quite understandably broke up with Jack and, yes, eventually lost the blue hair. And as a responsible gun owner, Uncle Ron reported Jack's misuse of a firearm to the cops, and now he's banned from owning a gun, I do believe. Now my sister also managed to successfully take a restraining order out against him and reported him for some other stuff because, as it turns out, like I suspected, he had been an abusive partner. So we look back at that story and tell it with a comedy angle, usually Uncle Ron doing the telling, but I'll tell you what. Finding out afterwards the type of things he put my sister through, psychological torture in particular, it made me wish that we were the kind of gun-toting, rootin'-tootin' Republican trigger-happy family that Jack clearly accused us of being. I'm not a violent person, but I do feel like at the very least he deserved to feel the fear of having 7 or 8 guns pointed at him to calm him down. So around 2015, I worked retail on Black Friday and agreed to be there from opening. Never, ever again though. It was the scariest incident of my life, and that was before I was nearly killed by an old man wielding a pickleball racket. And so the day started like any other Black Friday sales day. That is to say, all the staff were lined up like riot police, waiting for the doors to open and the customers to burst in and start fighting like it was a mosh pit over their 40% discounted TVs, or whatever else these other people like to buy on Black Friday. I don't know, I'm not a retail worker, I'm a security guard, and so I was on the front lines here, as you understand, but I was the first line of defense against angry moms wanting cheap baby formula or gnashing grannies trying to get their grandson a cheap Nintendo Playbox or whatever, and then insisting that I'm hiding the imaginary product from her. And I could see the crowd was getting restless through the front doors. The poor outdoor security staff were working extra hard to prevent a stampede, or what we like to call a crush, which is basically a stampede of people who could literally crush you. And at one point I was sure that I saw the glass on the front door start to crack. Well, thankfully I imagined that. Now we were all there, braced like we were ready for a riot when the doors were about to open, and I never felt more nervous in my life. I've worked Black Friday since, but this was my first time, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. Now let me tell you, when you see the footage of those riots and the way people fight each other to get their little bargains, it's not an exaggeration. If anything, it underplays the severity of what it's like. The doors open, and a human ocean bursts into the store. Now, I won't name the big brand store that I work at, I don't want to get fired, but pick one of the stores with footage of people going nuts over cheap televisions and discounted sound systems, and it's one of them. Now, each type of person you can imagine came bursting in that store that morning. You had the angry grandmothers with the sharp elbows and even sharper tongues, and you had the Joe Rogan wannabes who wrestled their way to the toy section trying to get the cheapest Furby or whatever boy's toy was doing the rounds. And then there were the big ladies trying to get their cheap hair dryers, and then all the types of everyone who wanted to get their hands on discounted 4K TVs and UHD players. Now you can't blame them. Some of the prices were obscene, and if I hadn't been at work, I might have been right there in the crowd fighting my way through for bargains like a rock'em sock'em robot or whatever. But alas, I was stuck corralling the crowd down the right aisles, trying to keep soccer moms from sucker-punching deadbeat dads, and I'm pretty sure at one point, I even saw some IRL streamer streaming the whole thing. Now, it was chaos, absolute chaos, just a royal rumble of retail that is far scarier when you're on the ground than any of the footage can possibly convey. But let me try, though. These are some of the things that just went down that day. 2 old men got in a fight over a bowling ball, which involved one of them smashing the other's knee out with said bowling ball. In the kitchen aisle, an angry mother of 4 got in a fight over the last blender, so she used the show model to try and knock her rival unconscious. Now this backfired, causing her to twist her wrist and the rival to swipe that blender out from under her. 2 different customers got trampled, including a broken arm, and thankfully there were no deaths though. Now quite possibly my favorite though was the 2 adult neckbeards who got into a fistfight over Magic the Gathering cards and ended up trashing the entire toys and games department by throwing each other against the shelving units. This also makes it sound like I wasn't doing my job, but trust me, I was. And so were the rest of my colleagues. If it wasn't for us, I'm convinced that there would have been deaths, multiple deaths. And the cops told us as much in the aftermath of the sale. There was so much damage, so much carnage that we ended up losing more stock to damage than we even sold. Now this might all sound comical and even silly, but I want you to consider this. Humans were willing to behave this way towards each other over a little bit of money off of a TV. One man broke another old man's knee with a bowling ball, like I said, and that injury will probably last for life. The blender to the head. Thankfully that didn't cause damage, but imagine if it had shattered. That could have taken someone's eye out. And on top of that, we've got these absolute clowns who trashed an entire aisle of children's Christmas presents because they wanted to fight over some playing cards. It doesn't sound so silly and funny when you look at it like that, does it? Working security during Black Friday really severely challenged my faith in humanity. I had to start going to therapy just to convince myself that the majority of people aren't selfish, awful humans, and I'm not convinced that's untrue. The therapy might be for other stuff as well. So when you see these crazy videos online, remember these aren't just one-off events that happen in far, far away Walmarts. These are your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, and they're prepared to crack you over the head with a 4K monitor if it means they can save $20 on that Nintendo Switch they've been coveting. Now I'm convinced that somewhere, Satan's watching a Black Friday Madness compilation on YouTube and just laughing his butt off. I just wanted to send this in to say, be careful if you ever go Black Friday shopping. I'd hate for you to lose your head over a Superman action figure or some rare Charizard. 'Cause know this, I've got dibs on that fella. So, funny story. My name is also Joel, weirdly enough. And this story didn't take place on Thanksgiving. It was the day before, but the outcome of the story is probably the thing that I'm most thankful for. I have a pretty overprotective mom, and I mean this in a very loving way. She's the best mom ever. Now, she didn't have the easiest time raising me and worked her butt off to be the best mom she could. Now, things are better now, and she has a wonderful husband, my stepdad, and we're a tight family. But she worries about me, and in particular a couple of years ago, she read an article about how the night before Thanksgiving has the highest rate of DUIs out of any night in the year. Now, I'm not sure if that's just Michigan, the state that I'm from, or everywhere, but apparently it's a fact. And so the year this happened, a couple of years ago, I was due to work the night shift at Kroger that Wednesday night. Now, Mom got really worried about this DUI thing, and she found out that it was so prevalent that it had been nicknamed Drinksgiving. Now, she wasn't worried about me drinking and driving, of course, but she was worried about me driving to and from work late at night and some drunk idiot crashing into me on the roads. She got so worked up about it, in fact, that eventually I promised her that I'd just walk to work and back that evening, even though it was a 40-minute trek either way. This seemed to placate her massively, and I thought, you know, the walk could actually be good for me anyway. The first half of my shift that night covered up until closing time, and then the second half involved restocking and cleaning and all the fun stuff that goes on at Kroger behind the scenes. Nothing really of note happened on the shift, except I did notice some guy come in absolutely trashed, staggering around and slurring his words. And I made sure that I was close to the checkout when he came to pay, because my younger female colleague was out on checkout, but he was fine, just very wrecked. And then I watched with this mounting horror I felt as he left and walked across the parking lot and got into the driver's side of his vehicle and swerved his way out of the lot. Now, for other things, I would feel like a bit of a narc or a bit of a pest, but I did get the guy's registration and call it in, so hopefully the cops pulled him over. Drunk drivers can get effed, in my opinion. And so my shift was done, and I started the long, cold walk home. I was about halfway back listening to some tunes on my iPhone, and I admit it was Taylor Swift. I am actually secretly a big fan, just sort of gazing at the sidewalk to avoid any puddles or ice or anything like that. And that's when I hear the sound of squealing tires and erratic driving, and I immediately look up. There was a car swerving back and forth across the road, and I had almost no time to react. The vehicle erratically spun towards me and with a burst of speed, mounted the sidewalk and crashed straight into me. Now, it felt like I had moved in slow motion, like some kind of action movie. I saw this muscle car barreling towards me and I dove backwards into the doorway of some store. The car slammed into the bricks and I heard the sound of crumpling metal and cracking concrete. But I felt very little pain, and I was sure as sure could be that I was either about to die, or maybe my spinal cord had been severed and I was paralyzed from the waist down. It took me a moment to realize that the car had stopped literally an inch from me, thanks to the depth of the doorway and the strength of the brick. I was shaking and crying and collapsed forward onto the hood of the car. I barely registered when the guy leaps out of the vehicle and was yelling and crying to himself, asking if I was okay, if I was hurt, if I could feel my legs, etc. Now, eventually I managed to calm down and began talking to the very calm, very clearly sober driver of the vehicle. It turned out that he hit a patch of black ice, lost control of his car, and in trying to correct it, had ended up spinning towards me instead. The cops came, of course, and he happily took a breathalyzer test which showed a 0.0 alcohol level in his bloodstream, which was nice to know. And it totally wasn't this guy's fault at all, I guess. He was just so apologetic. And he kept insisting that I go to the hospital to get checked out, but I knew I was fine, except for a few cuts and grazes from the cracking bricks. So instead, he paid for an Uber to get me home and gave me his card to stay in touch. My mom sent him an email about a week or so later, thanking him for being so kind and telling him that she hoped that he didn't hold any guilt, and I sent him something similar. Now that Christmas in the mail, I received a check for $1,000, and on the card he wrote something like, "Your life is worth so much more than this, but it's the least I can do." And so, almost being crushed to death by a muscular car like that didn't end up to be so bad after all. But let me tell you, those moments when the vehicle came blasting towards me, when I thought it was a drunk driver or worse, someone trying to hit me, that was the goddamn scariest moment of my life. And every year on Thanksgiving, I make sure to give thanks for surviving that terrifying ordeal. So some years ago now, myself and my then boyfriend went to Mexico City on vacation. It was absolutely beautiful, and we followed the tourist guides and kept ourselves as safe as possible. I made sure that my boyfriend and I rarely separated. Well, he made sure, really. He was a protective guy and deeply cared about me and my safety. And as you'll notice, sadly, I'm referring to him in the past tense. I don't know that he's dead, but I've obsessively read and researched similar cases to have a good idea of what happened to my beloved Mario. Now, we were visiting a large mall just outside of Mexico City and had everything you could want. Cheap technology to the latest fashion to wonderful old vinyl records. We both grew up in poor, rough parts of Mexico, and this vacation was a dream for us, really. We've been exploring like tourists, convincing ourselves what it would feel to be like the people who could just visit the country and spend time in the safe areas, avoiding the cartels and the violence and the burning tires and the screaming and all the parts you don't want to hear about. Now, visiting rich parts of Mexico City was kind of like our Disneyland. Now, the night before, our tour guide had taken us to the Capelitas out in the wilderness. He said it was little known by tourists, but because we were locals, he was happy to take us to visit. It was the shrine to Santa Muerta. It used to be common to find public ofrendas that locals would come to and pray, and there would be tributes to Our Lady of Guadalupe, Santa Maria or St. Jude, Santo Juan Diego, etc. And many classic saints, but in recent years, worship and tribute to Santa Muerta has flourished throughout Mexico. We are a people living in the shadow of death, and why should we not turn to Lady Death herself to hear our prayers? Death is invited upon us all, Dios mediante, and should not the Madre de Muerta receive her tribute? Will death not smile upon us if we kiss her feet and pray for bliss in the inevitable? And that is what many believe, anyway. Many others believe that the cartels have drenched our country in blood and forced Santa Muerta into the spotlight. I don't know. I just know that myself and my dearest Mario followed our guide out into the desert that night, and we made our offerings in front of Santa Muerta. And then within 24 hours, I never saw Mario again. We were exploring the mall. We didn't have many pesos to throw around, just window shopping was fun, and we would dream. Looking at the latest fashion, trying on risque dresses for Mario's approval, checking out the latest iPhones and browsing the latest records. We felt like shiny, happy people like the song goes, and then Mario needed to go use the bathroom. It was the first time all day that we'd been intending to separate, and I wanted to browse the lingerie store and maybe buy something secret for him, so it seemed like the perfect time. I found myself caught up browsing the bras and panties and fascinated and kind of horrified at how expensive it was to buy a piece of fabric that barely covered anything. And in the end, I settled for a lacy nightgown that was tasteful but sexy, and the sales clerk rang it up and I went outside ready to greet Mario. But there was no sign of him. I walked around the mall, calling for him, looking for him, but to no avail, and I went to the bathroom. Now, I must have seemed like some huge freak standing outside the men's room, calling Mario, Mario through the doorway, but there was no reply. And in the end, looking around and seeing nobody present, I quickly ran in there just in case. All the stalls were empty, all the urinals unoccupied. And I kept on investigating until an old white man came in and exclaimed, "Goodness me," in a very shocked voice, and I pretended that I was the cleaner and just quickly left. Now, I contacted mall security, and at first they wouldn't take me seriously at all, but then I kind of lied and said that we'd been worrying someone was following us. Now, on the cameras, we were able to see Mario enter the area where the bathrooms were, and then he never left. They checked the women's room in case he was in there somewhere, and of course he wasn't, and the only option that was left was that he'd left through the window, which was positioned in one of the many blind spots of the outdoor cameras, and then he left in a vehicle and was seemingly never seen again. Now, the next part was tearfully a blur to me. I remember telling detectives how Mario had recently proposed to me, and seeing a look pass between them like, yeah, this guy's left her at the altar, so to speak. But I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe my Mario would just ditch me like that. That wasn't him, it just wasn't. And then I started researching cases of people going missing from malls and public places, usually a member of a couple, to make it look like they ditched the other. As there was this one case that I read about where they eventually found the missing woman, and she was dead, and her body had been entirely hollowed out and filled with high-grade heroin, and then attempted to be smuggled over the border. Now every night I dream of Mario walking into that bathroom and being accosted by someone who'd entered through the window. They could have been let in by anyone, and then they could have knocked Mario out, taken him through the window with his accomplices, bundled into the back of a van, and then God knows what had happened to him since. Maybe he's still alive somewhere, being forced to work for the cartel. Maybe his body was used as a mule. Maybe whatever happened, Santa Muerte saw fit to make sure that his death was a peaceful one, if that's what occurred. Or maybe Mario really did just leave me alone while I was buying lingerie by fleeing through the bathroom window. If I found out this was true, I think I'd forgive him just so I knew that he was still alive. Every night I find myself praying to Santa Muerte that Mario simply got cold feet or decided he didn't love me anymore. The alternative is far too heartbreaking to bear. So I'm a woman in her early 20s, and last year was my first Thanksgiving alone, as I'd moved cross-country and couldn't make it back home for our usual meal. Now, I was pretty sad and depressed about all of this, even though Dad and my stepmom made a big effort to have a Zoom call with me and have a little party that day before Thanksgiving. Now, I decided that I was going to turn my frown upside down and be a good Christian and spend my Thanksgiving volunteering at a local soup kitchen. They'd been really struggling for volunteers for that day, apparently, so when I went in the week before and asked if they needed me, the large, older lady who runs it, her name was Belinda, gave me the biggest, warmest hug I'd ever had from someone I wasn't related to. And that made me feel a lot better and almost like I'd made the right decision. Now, on Thanksgiving Thursday, I arrived at the soup kitchen early and found myself waiting outside for Belinda to arrive. There were already a few folks hanging around, even though it would be another hour or so before we actually started serving food. Belinda arrived and was greeted by some of the folks who were waiting for the food, and clearly some of them were regulars, and Belinda greeted them warmly and they responded in kind. Only she introduced me as a new helper who was with us for Thanksgiving, and I quickly added, and hopefully more than that if Belinda will have me, because I'd already decided that I wanted to volunteer at this place regularly. Just seeing the way that these people's faces lit up at Belinda's arrival, knowing that they'd get a hot meal inside them. And so Belinda opened up. I didn't realize this, but they opened up an hour before the food went out to allow people a bit of time in from the cold. It was a particularly cold Thanksgiving that year, and I thought that this was a very kind gesture. I don't know what it's like at other soup kitchens, but there was a lot more than soup on the menu that day. We couldn't afford to put a whole Thanksgiving spread, of course, but a number of local businesses had contributed dishes which just needed heating up, including 3 incredibly prepared turkeys and 2 glazed hams from a local butcher. And the rest of the volunteers showed up, and we immediately went about cooking the food, as well as the traditional vats of soup, which would be the first thing on the menu, since it would be ready before the meat and casseroles. Belinda told me that the line to get in was around the block, and we were set to have the busiest Thanksgiving on record. And I could already see every seat was filled in the seating area itself, and spirits seemed high. I felt great, and I felt genuinely proud of my decision. So the soup was ready, and I was put on serving duties, filling up cups of the pumpkin and chestnut soup specifically. And I handed every cup over with a smile and a happy Thanksgiving, and then in my head, may Christ be with you as a little bit of a personal prayer that Jesus would watch over these people who clearly needed it. "Gimme soup, bitch." And the demand caused me to look up, almost expecting to see someone I knew or some kind of joke. And the guy who stood there looked about 80 and had a hard-lived 80 at that. He was blind in one eye, and his face was pockmarked with scars, and his hair was long and lanky but bald on the top, and he was stick-thin and wiry, wearing a military-style coat. And I'll never forget his face or his holy fingerless gloves or the look that he gave me with his one good eye. It was a look of utter, disgusting contempt as he eyed me up and down. Now, I tried to act as if though I'd misheard him in case I really had, so I told him that the soup was coming up, and that's when he starts to rant, saying I'm clearly some sanctimonious rich bitch with my fake-ass boobs. Not that it matters, but, they're not. And how I'm pretty and I know it, and I'm just there to make myself feel better. And then he sees the crucifix around my neck, which was hidden under my sweater, but I guess he somehow saw the imprint of the cross, and starts ranting about how I'm one of those do-gooder Christians who only helps people like him because we want a free pass into heaven. Now, I wasn't about to say anything in my defense to this guy, and I'm not going to explain myself too much here either. All I will say is that in my 25 years on Earth, there have been points where I have gone through certain things that would genuinely horrify you to hear. Parts of my childhood was so bad that I couldn't type about it even if I wanted to. And yes, I did feel good about myself for volunteering at the soup kitchen. Yes, I am a Christian. But is there anything wrong with either of those things? This freaking guy didn't know me, and he didn't have any right to judge me. And I'm sure he'd suffered too, probably terribly from the looks of him, but to assume that I was some privileged B-word who had it easy just because in his opinion I was attractive, how dare he? How absolutely dare he? And so I did what I've always learned to do in these situations. I responded as cheerfully and politely as possible, pretending that I hadn't heard a word he said because in a minute he'd be gone and I'd never have to see him again. I'd take my break, and by the time I was done, he'd probably have left. So I poured him his cup of soup and handed it over to him with a big smile, telling him that I hope he enjoyed it and had an absolutely wonderful Thanksgiving. Now, normally this makes people sort of run away feeling stupid, but not him. Oh no. This enraged this guy more than I could possibly have imagined. He took the cup of soup from me and the scalding hot soup and said, "I don't even want it," and called me the C word and threw the cup of soup in my face. Everyone around him reacted in horror, but I was just frozen, like I'd passed out on my feet. I vaguely remember him running and leaving the building and my face feeling weirdly cold. And the next thing I remember is actually waking up in the hospital. I have a skin condition that, among other things, makes my skin extremely sensitive to high temperatures. The soup had been hot enough to burn away part of my cheek and sent me into shock, which had caused me to pass out and stay unconscious for a few hours. The scalding soup permanently scarred my cheek. And it wasn't bad enough to warrant a skin graft, but there is a red mark there forever that gradually kind of looks like a birthmark. And I also required an operation on my eye, which thankfully was successful, and I retained my sight, but a small section of my right eye is now permanently bloodshot. Belinda had been at the hospital with me. I don't remember this, but apparently all I kept doing was worrying whether they'd closed the soup kitchen and that people had been able to get their meals, and she just kept assuring me that no, it was still running. Unfortunately, they were not able to catch the man who assaulted and permanently scarred me. He'd come bursting out that front door and nobody really had known why, and the whole thing had just been so sudden and bizarre. And the chances are, if it had happened to someone who didn't have a sensitive and unpleasant skin condition like mine, it would have just hurt like a mother lover, and that would have been that. Unfortunately, though, not in this case. I spent a few days in the hospital, and the thing that I kept telling myself was, this was just one guy. There are terrible people in every group, and the lesson that I've been taught here, I believe, is that forgiveness isn't necessarily what's important, but rather the lack of placing blame. So I still volunteer at that soup kitchen. I've become friends with some of the regulars, and I wish I could do more to help them. Belinda couldn't believe it, but it just felt right. Now, I'm not some kind of saint, though. There's a part of me, a very dark part hidden deep in the back of my mind, who continues volunteering at that soup kitchen in case that guy returns. And if he does, maybe I'll throw some soup in his face. The grocery store at the end of my block closes at 11 p.m. If you go after 10 p.m., you'll be able to get some good deals on discount products. It's also usually dead quiet, so you don't have to deal with other customers. Just one or two late-night shoppers like me and staff trying to stock the shelves to get things done early. That night, things felt weird on the walk over. It's only a 5-minute walk, but I was certain that I was being followed. I looked around and, sure enough, at a distance, there seemed to be a guy in a pastel blue hoodie and white pants. He didn't seem threatening, he was just sort of walking at the exact same distance behind me the whole way. If I stopped, he seemed to find an excuse to stop as well. And so I go into the grocery store, and down the end of the aisle I saw the guy who I believe had been following me. But that was absolutely impossible, I thought, because he definitely hadn't passed me. And so I head down the aisle a little, keeping an eye on my guy, and eventually I realize it's not the same guy, but he seems to be dressed exactly the same. Now, I don't know how to prove it to you exactly, but it definitely wasn't a uniform or a coordinated gang outfit or anything like that. What kind of uniform consists of a baby blue hoodie and some white jogging pants? Now, I heard the front door of the grocery store open, and in walks a guy who's been following me previously. The first thing he does is come and stand right next to me, looking at the same food that I was, these sort of nacho kits, if I remember, and just sort of standing weirdly close to me. It felt threatening, but without any direct threats happening, if that really makes any sense. And so I edged down the aisle, and the guy stuck to me like glue. Meanwhile, I could see the other, identically dressed guy just sort of standing there watching the both of us, pretending to eye up some cheese. Now, after a while, I head into another aisle, and who do I see but a third guy, dressed exactly the same. Now, he was just sort of looking at some cereals the whole time. Now, these didn't look like they were uniforms, and they definitely didn't work at the store, but the weird thing was, they did not seem to make any acknowledgement that they knew each other either. The only thing I was certain of was that they were all watching me. Now, I'm just a guy around 5'10" and not exactly some pushover, so I wasn't as worried as I could have been, but I don't know how to describe it. I got this really sort of dark and wrong feeling from all of it, like the people who were surrounding me had some kind of darkness to them. Now, I'm not normally the kind of person who gets paranoid or attributes things to the supernatural, but I certainly don't think that these boys were actually demons, but they felt demonic, if that makes sense. Now, eventually the one who'd spend most of his time standing right next to me moved off to do some grocery shopping of his own. I go around to the final area near the checkouts, and I see a fourth, identically dressed guy walking towards the second guy that I'd seen. I expected them to greet each other, but instead, they showed absolutely no sign that they even knew each other, and in fact, one of them apologized for getting in the way of the other. And there also appeared to be some kind of slight dislike between the two, which I still can't really explain. I sort of hung back, like a coward, and waited until all four of them had finished their individual small grocery picks. Now, 3 of them used the self-checkouts. One of them paid at the kiosk because he had also bought cigarettes and a lottery ticket. And they all left at different times, and aside from that brief interaction near the checkout, they'd never even interacted with each other, really. Now, before you guessed that maybe they were siblings or quadruplets playing a joke, 2 of them were white and one of them was sort of a light-skinned black guy, and the 4th, I don't know what he was as far as race goes. Now, they certainly weren't related, and they seemed to be different heights. Now, they were the same age and wore the same strange baby blue hoodie and white jogging pants, and they all just sort of kept watching me, and I finally started to understand how those gang stalkers fall down that rabbit hole. And so when I got to the checkout, the elderly lady who rang up my items was someone that I saw there often as a regular customer, and she glanced around the store and then leaned in and whispered to me and asked if I'd seen those guys just now, who had all been dressed exactly the same. I said, yeah, it was wild that there were 4 of them at one time. And she shook her head and said that in total there must have been 6 of these guys. 2 of them had left the store before I had arrived. And then she gave some speech about how she wasn't normally the superstitious type, but they gave her the heebie-jeebies. I didn't blame her. I asked her if she had any theories, and now she said that the best she could come up with was that it was the Saturday after Black Friday, but did that even mean anything? Did that have any kind of significance? Now, I've never really been able to find anything. Now, the walk home was 5 minutes, but it felt like 5 hours. The checkout lady almost begged me to get an Uber home, but there was no way that I was paying for an Uber to drive around the corner, and I would have felt like an idiot. Now, I didn't see the guys on the walk home, and nor have I seen them again. I know it seems like an anticlimax, but it was by far the creepiest, weirdest things that's ever happened to me while out at the grocery store. Now, if anyone has any theories as to what was going on, that'd be great, but 2 of them watched me intently, one of them stuck to me like glue until he just suddenly didn't, and 2 of them ignored me entirely, and 2 of them had left before I even arrived. So one of them at least was interested in me. Why were they all dressed the same? Why did they have the same aura? Were they gang members who decided that I wasn't worth the hassle? What does everyone else really think? Because I may just be the only person out there who gets freaked out when someone's wearing a baby blue hoodie and some white sweatpants. Most families have Thanksgiving traditions. Some of them are wholesome, some of them are silly, and some of them are just plain bizarre. I know this because I read a Reddit thread about them, and I was going to post my own family tradition and the outcome, but in the end I decided that I didn't want to bring the mood down into the Earth's core. So I thought, hey, why not send it into Let's Read instead? Look, I'm not going to pretend that my dad isn't an idiot. He is. An absolute goofball, and I love him for it. But he'd be the first to admit it. But sometimes his dumb flippery gets him into a bit of hot water. Things like managing to offend a waitress at Red Lobster somehow, or nearly losing a major contract at work for sending a boomer Minions meme to the company that they were courting. Now, this idiot is just bad at jokes. He once decided to prank Mom on April Fool's Day for telling her that he'd been cheating on her and wanted a divorce. Only the absolute clown got the date wrong and forgot that March has 31 days in it, and pulled the prank on the morning of March 31st, so Mom had absolutely no reason to suspect it was a joke. And boy, he had a lot of groveling to do after that one. And so you get the point. He's a lovable goofball boomer dad who just isn't funny at all, mostly, but he is indeed lovable. He also caused Thanksgiving to be pretty terrible one year. And so for many years, we had this old serrated electric carving knife for cutting the turkey. It was one of those serrated knives where they're not actually sharp unless you're sawing into something, and on top of that, it was blunted through years of use. And so every year, to entertain the kids, before cutting the turkey, he'd take this damn knife and pretend to cut his hand off with it. It was this whole gimmicky thing. He'd press the blade against his upper wrist and then wow the little kids with how strong his skin was because he could just press a knife against it. And then for the final shock value, he'd turn the knife on by flicking the switch. Except It wasn't plugged in, of course, and it wouldn't actually operate. And of course, the rest of the family had to then explain to the little kids that they shouldn't do this, and the knife was blunt, yada yada yada, and it was just some stupid thing Dad always did. And so this one year, the carving knife had finally died, and Mom replaced it with a new one. She told Dad, and she told him multiple times not to do his knife trick this year, and she made him promise, but I guess she didn't explain exactly why. Now here's the problem. Serrated blades can be crazy sharp if they're of a certain design. Electric carving knives these days are famous for being way more sharp than people realize. But Dad, in his arrogant wisdom, was still convinced that this wouldn't matter. Besides, it wasn't plugged in. He'd just be careful and make sure that he didn't press it into his skin too much. Of course, this was his explanation after the fact. At the time, none of us knew that he was going to do it. So picture the scene. There's about 15 family members crowded around the table in our large dining room, ready to fill their plates. Dad's about to do the opening ceremony and cut the turkey. And he does it, and he does the trick. He presses the blade against his wrist. Everyone starts to roll their eyes, and then Dad suddenly yells the F word because, even being as careful as possible, the serrated blade cuts right into his wrist. And then the pain causes his other hand to spasm, but it's okay, right, because the carving knife isn't plugged in. Well, no. It's not plugged in because it was a rechargeable knife. So his finger slips, he presses the switch, and we all watch in horror as his brand new, incredibly sharp electric carving knife slices through his wrist like butter. Everyone's screaming, except for Dad, who's just sort of staring down at his severed hand at the blood spraying from it. He's woozy, dizzy with shock, and sort of lifts his arm up, leaving the severed hand behind. And of course, blood sprays everywhere. All over the Thanksgiving dinner spread, all over the family, all over the screaming, crying family members. And I'm the one who springs into action. The knife's still running, embedded into the table now, and I reach through the blood and gore and shut it off. And then I grab my own father's hand and rush him to the kitchen to put it in a bag of ice. Meanwhile, other members of the family are trying to snap my dad out of the shock that he's clearly in. We're calling 911. Others are yelling that the ambulance will take too long, etc. In the end, I drag Dad to my car, throw him into the back seat, place his ice bag hand in the passenger seat, and just hightail it to the emergency room. And I'll never forget it. Dad was unable to say much of anything on the drive there, but he did let out one thing. "Thanks for giving me a hand, baby girl." God. If he hadn't been in the back seat with a severely bloody stump of a wrist, I probably would have punched him in the jaw in that moment. Unfortunately, they couldn't save his hand, as there was too much nerve damage that had been caused by the cut, and when my mom arrived at the hospital, she insisted on making up a slightly less embarrassing story of how he severed his hand. I forget the exact details, but I'm sure they didn't buy it. So, Dad only has one hand now. Thankfully, it was his left, and he's right-handed, and that's the thing he always says each year for Thanksgiving now. At least it wasn't my useful hand. And knowing Dad, he wants to say something even more cruder than that. So, that's how my lovable goofball dad effed around and found out, and if anyone asks, he tells them it was bitten off by a shark. He has a prosthetic hand now, and yes, you can best believe that he uses that damn prosthetic hand for boomer dad pranks wherever he can. And the best was last year. My daughter brought her new boyfriend over for Thanksgiving, and they're high school seniors, and her boyfriend is a sweetheart, and Dad introduces himself by walking up behind him, placing his prosthetic hand on the poor kid's lap and saying, "This is what happens to the last guy who got handsy with my granddaughter." Thankfully, me and my daughter had warned him in advance, and the smart-ass kid took the prosthetic hand, turned to face my father, and shook it with a very "pleased to meet you." I think he's a keeper. So I've been working at a Walgreens for over 30 years now, Now, this happened just a couple of years ago, and to this day it remains one of the most disgusting things to ever happen, but not to me, but a colleague. Now, Jamie was a new girl working checkout at the pharmacy. I'm a pharmacist, so I sign off and dispense prescriptions, but Jamie sold over-the-counter medication and would hand out prepared prescriptions over to the customer, etc. And so checkout staff at the pharmacy have a small degree of medical training, but nothing really major. If a customer needs proper medical advice, they'll be sent over to me or one of my colleagues, and if we can't help, we'll advise them to seek medical attention. Now, this one day, a middle-aged guy comes over to Jamie at her post. I'd seen him before, collecting prescriptions with his wife, and I was pretty sure that he had 2 daughters as well. This time, he was alone. He told Jamie that he was suffering from a rash on his upper thigh, and it was extremely aggravating. He told her that he'd taken some photos with his camera phone that just showed the rash and would be easier and less embarrassing than having to show his actual thigh. Jamie should have directed him to me, but being inexperienced, she agreed to take a look at the photo. But as it was, she deduced that the rash was caused by some kind of allergic reaction and to try an antihistamine cream which should help the rash go down. All was well for about a week, and then that rashy guy returned. He said that initially the cream had helped, but it stopped being effective, and he'd taken a new photo to show the current state of things. Now, this made sense to Jamie, as it was entirely possible that he simply needed a stronger dose of the cream, something she'd mentioned to him beforehand. This time, as she tells it, when he showed her the photo, it was angled slightly differently, and you could unfortunately see a small sliver of his nut on the right-hand side of the photo. Jamie tried her best to hide her blush, and she was only 19 after all, but this dude didn't seem to notice. She recommended that he try a stronger version of the cream, and hopefully that should clear things up. Now, a couple of weeks later, when I'm on shift, he shows up again. I notice him this time, and it sort of nags me in the back of my mind that he always happens to show up when Jamie's on shift, even though she worked very limited hours per week as a temporary job while studying some kind of biology at college. Now, this time, when he shows her the photo, you can clearly see the majority of his left ball and a sliver of, well, you know what. Jamie, ever the professional, did not acknowledge this despite flushing very red. Now, Mr. Rashman asked her if she was okay, and even joked that his bare thigh was turning her on. Now, I overheard this and made a note to talk to Jamie after he had left to let her know that she didn't have to deal with people like that. Now, she eventually admitted to me that the photos had become increasingly revealing, and she hadn't entirely known how to deal with that. At that moment, I was furious. However, she explained to me that sometimes on iPhones, they don't show you the entire area of the photo, and it's possible to accidentally show slightly more around the outskirts than intended. I told her I thought that she was being extremely generous and to be super careful around this creep. No, eventually he turns up again, and shock and horror, his rash has returned. He tells Jamie that he's taken the photo as tastefully as possible, but he needs to show the full rash. And so, as you can expect, he whips out an entire picture of his wiener, with only a portion of his right ball hidden. Now, furthermore, the rash was the same size as it always has been, which, as Jamie then realized, was an almost perfect square. And she handled herself great. She said that she was extremely concerned about the customer's safety and that there was a severe risk of permanent loss of function, and she had to call the trained pharmacist right away. Now, this guy immediately started freaking out and said it wasn't a big deal and to not bother me, but Jamie called out saying that she had seen evidence of a potentially devastating injury and could I help. Now, this rash guy was torn between worrying about his harassment being outed and slightly believing that Jamie was telling the truth that he was about to maybe lose function of his yoo-hoo. And so I came straight out of the pharmacy and he refused to show me the photo. I asked him why he was comfortable showing Jamie but not me, and I'd seen it all before, and he started stumbling over his words and didn't have an answer for me. I half expected him to turn and leave and never christen our door again, but instead, he did something very unexpected. He grabbed a bottle of cough medicine and threw it hard against the counter, causing it to burst, and then he fled in the ensuing confusion. I'm not sure if he thought the cough medicine would function as some kind of kung fu smoke bomb or what, but clearly he'd forgotten that as a client of the pharmacy, we had his name and address, as well as all the details of his family. Now, we reported the whole incident to the cops, who said that they may not have been able to pursue any sort of harassment charges, as he could have claimed accidental reveal, but that by smashing the cough syrup, he implied intent with his behavior, which allowed us to press charges for that and involved his wife finding out about everything. Clearly, he just wanted to intimidate a young pharmacy worker, and instead he ended up on the offenders registry. Probably not the outcome he was hoping for. So this happened in the late 2000s. My little cousins were unholy terrors, to say the least. 2 boys, 8 and 9, the sons of my paternal uncle. They were born 2 months apart, have 2 different moms, neither of whom are my uncle's wife, and they spend other weekends with their dad, and I guess you can't blame them for being a little messed up and out of control when their family background is just so convoluted. Now, this explanation makes my uncle sound like some kind of womanizer who went around inseminating a variety of different women, and, well, I guess that's true, but not for nefarious reasons. First girlfriend actually died in a car accident a month after giving birth to Monkey, the oldest son, and my uncle had a sort of friends with benefits consolation hookup with one of his best friends, and the contraceptive broke and she got pregnant, and they decided to keep the baby, who's named Morley. And so thankfully, he has a great relationship with Morley's mom, and things are as good as they could be, I guess. He's also now happily married with a 2-year-old daughter who Mikey and Morley idolize. But the boys, who we call the twins even though they're not, and they have different moms, were absolute prank kings. They loved nothing more than causing chaos, pulling off jump scares, the kind of goofs that you get from joke stores, you know the types of things. Exploding cigarettes, lighters that squirt water, dollar store crap. It was always in good fun, but it was constant. You knew that any family gathering was going to be about the twins, and they made darn sure that we were darn sure of it. Now, it makes me so sad looking back. I miss the days when these dumb little kids were the pride and joy of the family. I miss the days when the family was a thing. Now, fair warning, this is not a happy story. It doesn't have a happy ending. And when you give thanks this Thanksgiving, make sure that you show gratitude for your loved ones who are still with you. Don't take anything for granted. Things can change on a dime, and life has no rewind buttons. No kid deserves to have the weight of what happened with the twins on their shoulders. Now, that Halloween, the twins had gone as pumpkin ghouls, basically skeleton onesies with creepy pumpkin masks. It was kind of cool, and the twins were very pleased with themselves. I'd taken them trick-or-treating, which made them feel badass to be chaperoned by their cool cousin, even if they could not grasp why a girl had dressed as Jason Voorhees, because Jason's a boy. Kids are odd creatures. And so the twins weren't content on using their pumpkin masks just once. In their minds, pumpkins are Thanksgiving related too, which is true, I guess, with pumpkin pie and all that jazz. So they smuggled their pumpkin masks into our family Thanksgiving gathering in their backpacks, just waiting to find the perfect moment to use them. The woman of our family did the cooking at our Thanksgiving get-together. Maybe this is a bit rude, but the truth is, Grandma, my mom, and my uncle's wife were the best chefs by far. Unfortunately, I did not inherit Mom's penchant for delicious culinary skills, and you could say I have a particular set of skills, and my skills lie elsewhere, extremely far from a kitchen. I'm a programmer. And so the twins decided a great prank would be to hide in the broom closet in the kitchen and burst out on whichever poor, unsuspecting chef happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. And this just happened to be my grandma, preparing the gravy boats. Grandma had just finished mixing up this thick gravy. We always have a selection of different thicknesses to suit everyone's taste, when the twins came bursting out of the closet in their pumpkin masks, yelling whatever spooky nonsense they decided to scream. Grandma was not a young woman. She was in her early 70s when this happened, and despite being used to the twins' antics and jump scares, I guess this time it caught her. She dropped the huge gravy boat onto the floor, which shattered, sending gravy and glass spilling all over the tiles near the kitchen door. And then the way the twins told it, she began to clutch at her heart. She was breathing really heavy and leaned forward to steady herself and then just collapsed into a chair at the breakfast bar. Now the twins panicked, pulled their masks off, and ran to Grandma to check if she was okay. She was still clutching her chest, breathing hard, and the kids were maybe crowding her and apologizing or whatever. And Grandma told them to give her space, and she was fine, she just needed a minute. But the way the twins tell it, they were absolutely sure that they'd given Grandma a heart attack and killed her. Thankfully, that was not the case. Now, what did happen, though, was that Granddad came running in from wherever, panicked by the sound of the gravy smashing onto the floor, and he threw the door open, ran straight into the kitchen, and immediately slipped on the thick, spilled gravy all over the floor. Now, I was behind them when this happened. I saw it all go down. I saw Granddad skid, his arms pinwheeling in a way that was almost comical if not for what happened next. He fell forward, his nose hitting the corner of the table, and they say it killed him instantly, the bone of his nose being thrust backwards into his brain. But I don't believe them. I saw him writhing on that floor. I saw him clawing at his face, and the way his neck was flopping at an almost impossible angle. I saw him take at least a minute to die. And so did Grandma, and so did the twins. We all watched as our beloved Granddad died in a pool of gravy and glass in front of his wife and grandsons, all of whom would later blame themselves for his death. Grandma blamed herself for overreacting and dropping that gravy, and the twins blamed themselves for pretty much everything. And you can understand why they did, even at that age. Grandma didn't even make it to Granddad's funeral, as she passed away a few days later of what I like to say is a broken heart. Her heart just gave out, and of course the twins blamed themselves for that too. They insisted that they weakened her heart by what they did. And no matter what we said to them, no matter how much we tried to convince them that they were just kids having fun, doing kid things, they wouldn't listen. Mikey made it to about 18. Morley's still around, but he's in and out of rehab, and the whole family does everything we can try to convince him to forgive himself, but he just won't. None of us blame Mikey and Morley. I just wish Morley wouldn't blame himself. So, this Thanksgiving, be grateful for the ones you love and what you share with them, because you never know when the most ridiculous, unexpected, and unseen event might just change your whole family's lives forever. I remember when I did my onboarding at my grocery store, and I had to watch some BS video teaching me all sorts of crap I already knew, and a bit of stuff that I didn't. One of the main things that I did know was that you shouldn't directly confront aggressors or shoplifters. You should let them steal the item and then call the cops. I knew this, with or without the video, but it's such a hard thing to actually convince yourself of. If I see some dude stealing something, it's in my nature to want to mess that guy's day up. I don't want to sit back and call the cops, you know? I want to dive in there like some kind of manly, badass hero like Let's Read, my favorite YouTuber male role model. And so this video says something like, "Do not engage. Under no circumstances must you put yourself in danger. The shoplifter could be armed. They could be dangerous. Your life is worth more than a tin of Spam or a potato. This isn't the Apple Store. Blah, blah, blah." And so I'm thinking, fine, sure. I'm not dying for a company that probably won't even remember my name 5 minutes after the funeral. So I kept my head down, followed the rules, and did my job exactly as I was trained. Now, it was just a stupid grocery store job. I was a stalker. We all got by via doing our jobs and really nothing else anyways, and it's how you survive a minimum wage job in the first place. But then came in a guy named Doc. He wasn't a doctor. I don't think he even had a PhD. He was just one of those guys who liked calling himself Doc because I guess his real name was Walter, something that didn't sound very cool. And so Doc watched the training videos And he came back saying to us something like, "No way am I letting people steal from right under my nose." Now we respond, "Oh, sure thing, Doc, old pal. Wait till you're up against a 6'5" biker stealing a can of beans. Who needs the money?" "Should just get a job like the rest of us," Doc said, as if he hadn't gotten the job because his uncle was the assistant manager. Now from then on, Doc was on the lookout for shoplifters. He was determined to catch one in the act just so he could prove himself and take down one of the bad guys. Now weeks had passed and then months, and Doc was stuck as a shelf stalker just like myself. The handful of shoplifters had been handled by the security guards, and Doc was itching to spot a baddie who could be his little nemesis. Now eventually, that nemesis showed up. She was a very old grandmother-looking character, later discovered to be in her 80s, and she walked around with a stick, browsing the shelves and examining the items. Occasionally, she put some old person food in her basket. But then, while Doc and I were watching her, this old lady slipped a small can of sardines into her purse. And that was it. She'd stolen something, and Doc was ready. This was the moment that he'd been gearing for. Now, I tried to tell him that you have to wait for them to leave the store to prove intent to steal, and I tried to tell him that there were really good reasons to wait and call the police. But Doc just scoffed at me and said, "You don't mess with Doc," and approached this old lady. Now, Doc was not the most tactful guy. He went straight in and said something like, "I saw you steal that can of sardines. I think it's best that you accompany me to the security office." As if this junior stalker even had the ability to handle shoplifters. No, the old woman just sort of looked at him, almost with pity, and she reached into her purse, and I was hoping that she'd just remove the sardines and pretend it had been a mistake and everyone could move on. But no, what she pulled out next was a goddamn butcher's knife. I don't remember exactly what she yelled, but it was something like, "You'll never take us alive, officers." And then, with a strength entirely unexpected from a frail old lady, she plunges this butcher's knife straight into Doc's chest, right by his heart. And the next thing I hear is the old lady murmuring something before running faster than I would have possibly ever expected her to, towards the exit and disappearing off into the parking lot. I don't think any of us ever spared the old lady any more thought at that moment. We were all tending to Doc and putting pressure on that wound around the knife and calling the paramedics, calling the cops. Now, long story short, Doc survived, but barely. The blade nicked his heart, and if it had been any further to the left, he would have been done for. And believe it or not, this old lady got away scot-free. Security footage seemed to suggest that maybe she was someone dressed like that. Honestly, looking back, it was all utterly bizarre. Now, it certainly taught Doc the reason why we were told not to engage with shoplifters. You never know when the old lady stealing sardines might be a knife-wielding maniac who nearly ends your life. So I'm a woman in my 40s, and I run a Meals on Wheels service. I run the business all year round, but on Thanksgiving, I go that little extra mile to just bring a bit of extra joy to my elderly and disabled clients. Now, there was this one old fellow that I used to visit, and he only had me booked in for Thanksgiving. He did fine most of the year, but he liked having a nice Thanksgiving meal prepared for him, and I think he liked the company too. He told me a number of times that he didn't have any family and it was just him. So Thanksgiving 2018, I turned up at his house with a special ham roast prepared for him with love. I looked forward to seeing this old fella. I was kind of excited for him to answer the door and see his usual beaming smile, his shiny white false teeth perched precariously in his mouth. No, I'm just trying to sound silly here, but I was a little surprised when a much younger guy answered the door. Now, I told him who I was, Meals on Wheels, and explained that I was here to see that old fella and cook for him. And the young guy looked confused for a second and then said, "Oh, damn. His grandfather was in the bathroom and must have gotten the timing wrong." and the guy invited me in and encouraged me to start preparing the food ready for the old guy to finish his bath, and that it'd be a nice treat when he got done bathing and realized that he had a Thanksgiving meal to look forward to. Now, the young relative ran upstairs very quickly, and I heard him calling through the bathroom door, telling his grandfather that the Meals on Wheels lady was there for him. And I couldn't hear the grandfather's response, of course, but why would I? Now, I went about warming up the food that I'd brought. Typically, we cook it in advance, and then it just needs heating up in the client's oven. And the process takes maybe 10 minutes, so I went to wander around the living room, which I'd been in many times. The grandson, who I'd imagine was probably in his mid-20s, was still upstairs, maybe getting his granddad out of the bathroom. Now, I started looking at some of the photos on the wall. They all just showed my elderly client at different stages in his life. However, I started to notice something odd. The young man who'd let me in didn't seem to appear in any of these photos. In fact, there was nothing that I could see that suggested that my client even had grandkids. And then I remembered. He told me previously that he didn't have any living family, so who the hell was this young guy who let me in? The old man was upstairs in the bathtub, so there was nothing suspicious, right? And then I realized I had absolutely no evidence that my client really was upstairs in the bathroom. All I'd heard was the young guy talking as if he was speaking to someone. It could have been completely fabricated for all I knew. I decided to play it safe and called upstairs that the food was almost ready and was my client nearly ready to come down. And the young guy shouted down, sounding almost annoyed in that, yeah, they were coming. He was just helping Grandpa dress himself and various things. This was definitely suspicious. The old fella might have been a Meals on Wheels client, but he was healthy and fit enough not to need home help, and he certainly did not need help getting dressed after a bath. Still, though, it was possible that maybe he'd fallen and there was a reasonable explanation for this. Now, I turned the oven off and left the food in there and called upstairs that I was going to be going because I had other clients to see, so I'd left the food warming in the oven. I didn't receive a reply, so I decided that I'd just leave and then call in a wellness check once I was safely out of the house. However, as I tried to leave, I discovered that the front door was locked. Now, it was one of those types of doors with a deadbolt where you actually need a key to unlock it from the inside, and it had been locked with that deadbolt. Obviously, something was wrong here. I could hardly call the cops and say that I might have had been locked in an old guy's house by a suspicious character, so I just decided to try the back door. And that way, of course, was also deadbolted. I'd left my cell phone in the van because typically we weren't supposed to bring devices in the clients' homes, and so I headed into the living room to either use the landline or see if there was a window that I could open to escape from or something. Now, this fake grandson was standing there, wearing nothing but his tidy whities and a poop-eating grin on his face. He started on some rant about how a dried-up old hag like me would surely be flattered to sleep with him, and that he'd even pay me if I did certain things. Now, I was speechless, disgusted. I'm happily married, and even if I wasn't, my God. I told him as much and told him that if he didn't unlock the door right this minute, I'd call the cops. Now, he just sort of laughed at that as if that was somehow a complete impossibility. And still no idea to this day why he was so confident about that. So the fake grandson approaches me and says that if I won't take him up on his generous offer, then considering I'm technically a home invader, I'm unsure of what logic he was using to decide that he had no choice but to defend himself. I asked him what in God's name he was talking about, and he just looked me in the eye, point blank, and just said, "I'm going to touch you, and then depending on how I feel, I might just bury your body in the basement." I could tell he was serious. I could also tell that he was seriously on something. Later, via the police report, I found out that he was on an absolutely ridiculous amount of cocaine, but at the moment all I knew was that there was no way that this pasty creep was going to get his hands on me. And from visiting my client every Thanksgiving, I knew the living room well, and I knew that behind me there was a fireplace, and besides that, a set of tools for cleaning that said fireplace. A poker, a brush, and one of those long metal dustpans. And that's what I managed to grab when I reached behind me blindly. and that's when I swung forward, cracking my would-be assailant straight in the crotch. He howls, screams, and fell to the floor, and just for good measure, I brought that pan down again on him, the flat underside slamming into his clearly aroused groin. And I later found out that it's possible to break someone's you-know-what, and that's exactly what I think I did. Unfortunately, this is also why my attempted freak managed to get away with a suspended sentence, because I was forced to lower the charges to avoid him countersuing for some fairly serious bodily damage. But it felt pretty worth it regardless, and I'm pretty sure I dissuaded him from trying to touch anyone else in the future. Now, I found out that my client had unfortunately passed away the week before, and due to his lack of family, his Meals on Wheels order had yet to be canceled. The guy who attempted to trap me there was the new tenant, and apparently decided to celebrate his Thanksgiving by doing a truckload of drugs and trying to kidnap a Meals on Wheels worker. I don't know what became of him after the disappointingly short legal proceedings in which I had to back down from pushing too hard after I basically broke his wiener, but again, I think I did the world a favor. So I'm thankful for my near miss that day, and also thankful for my perfect aim with that dustpan. I never used to work Black Friday, I flat out refused. And so as a compromise, each year I agreed to stay late with one other colleague and prepare for Black Friday. It wasn't such a big deal back then. We'd just run a big sale on the Friday and that was it. You know how Black Friday used to be. But it did mean setting up some nice displays the night before and making the store look presentable and exciting. Now, this was back when sales weren't run every 5 minutes, so they were actually quite a big deal if you were trying to save money. Now, remember when the January sales used to start after Christmas and offered some really great savings that you'd never find at any other point throughout the year? Black Friday was like that, but just a single day. So I refused to work Black Friday because I cannot deal with that many demanding customers. But I was happy to take charge of the lovely, quiet setup the night before. Now, as I recall, I was setting up a pyramid of VHS player boxes when I first heard the sound. It came from near the kitchen appliance section, and I knew that neither of my coworkers were around there because I could see them. And it sounded like a refrigerator door opening and closing, which was kind of eerie because there was no reason why any of them should ever be opened outside of a demo. In my infinite bravery, I decided to ignore it and move on to the next display, which was a set of discount stereo system components. Then one of my colleagues came over to me and asked if there was anyone else here, because they were sure that they'd seen a fourth staff member hanging around in the area where the camcorders and cameras were. I told them no, it was just us three, but we'd go investigate. There was no sign of anyone, but one of the cameras was slightly misaligned as if it had been moved, and I decided to check the footage, and that's when I saw something odd. There was a few seconds of film that showed a guy with a very thick mustache and big, thick Coke bottle glasses staring into the camera, almost looking like he was in shock. And then quickly the footage ended. Unfortunately, the display model was not correctly set up for the time and date, so I wasn't able to see for sure exactly when the strange recording had been made. The answer was soon provided for us, though, when the storeroom door visibly creaked open in front of us and then just slammed shut. Now, there was no way that this was me or any of my colleagues, and so the three of us ran to the storeroom and did the bravest thing we could, and we locked it from the outside and then looked in through the window. That same guy that we'd seen on the film was sitting in the corner of the stockroom, dressed in pajamas with a sleeping bag on the floor beside him. Obviously, in that moment, we called the cops. And it turns out that what had happened was the customer had hidden in the store at closing that night so that he could be able to be there bright and early when we opened for Black Friday by never having left the store in the first place. In many ways, it was all kinds of wholesome, other than the breaking and entering. However, things took a darker turn when the cops searched through the guy's belongings, and they found a camcorder taken from the shelf, and I guess I hadn't noticed that it was missing at the time. And the footage they found on there was very disturbing though. He must have filmed it within the previous few hours, and it included footage of both myself and my other female colleague on shift in compromising and very revealing positions from under the stalls. This creep must have been hiding in the bathroom waiting for us to enter, and having worked out how the camcorder worked, decided to give him some overnight entertainment to keep himself occupied while he waited for Black Friday. Naturally, we pressed every charge in the book and he faced some pretty hefty consequences. Now, I was less impressed at the footage having been played back in court, but it was worth it just to send this complete creeper down for a decent amount of time. Now, I'm sure he's long since released by now because this was quite a while ago, but I hope I never have to encounter that creepo weirdo Black Friday pervert again, if he's even still alive. And maybe it makes me a bad person, but I kinda hope he isn't. Back in the early 90s, my family had just moved to a new town and I had to go through the whole ordeal of making new friends as the new kid in school. It was the first year of high school, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but most of the kids already knew each other and had their established cliques and groups, and I hadn't really found my place. And there was this one kid, though, Tad, he went by, who was a popular and very amicable guy, but he didn't really seem to have any friends that he particularly hung out with. It was like he sort of jumped from one group to the next, being pals with everyone but not really having any people of his own. Now, after a few days, I guess he decided that I was his people and was rapidly becoming fast friends. Now, he was super chill, very laid back, a bit of a class clown, but incredibly smart and actually funny, unlike just about every other high school kid who thinks they're a comedian. Now, that November, he handed me an envelope. Inside it was a very formal, very nicely printed invitation to spending Thanksgiving dinner at the Smith's house, not their real name. Now, Tad was kind of cagey about it, almost as if he didn't actually want me to say yes, but I think I only picked up on that in retrospect. At the time, I was unsure because I always enjoyed spending Thanksgiving with my family. We'd usually go to my uncle and aunt's house and have a big extended family gathering. Now, I talked to my parents about it and they were insistent that I accept the invitation. There would be plenty of family Thanksgivings and they wanted me to make friends and have a finally good time. And they sold me on it, and by the time the big day came, I was very excited. Now, when I arrived at the Smith's house, Tad answered the door and I was surprised to see that he was dressed sort of fancy. Like, have you ever seen that review bra guy on YouTube? He was actually dressed like him, with all of his hair slicked back and a waistcoat on like he was dressed for church. And I was dressed in my usual normal 90 kids attire, and Tad looked me up and down and I saw some kind of worry come across his face and didn't really understand it. Now, he led me into the living room where his mom and young sister were, and they introduced themselves and they seemed great, although kind of strange and maybe malnourished perhaps, like a bit skinny. Now, Tad's mom, Jennifer, gently told me that typically the family dressed smart for Thanksgiving, but hopefully Mr. Smith would understand the miscommunication. Now, this was starting to make me feel a bit nervous. And then there was a little sister who talked to me in such an odd, polite way. The house itself also felt kind of lifeless, like it was almost too clean. It didn't look lived in. There were no family portraits on the walls, no memorabilia, no magazines on coffee tables, nothing. It could have been a house straight out of a catalog or what I now know would be called a show home, and it just sort of smelled sterile. It was all so strange. So Mrs. Smith led us into the dining room. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but my heart just sank. See, I was used to Thanksgiving spreads being kind of awesome, and this was just pathetic. A turkey and 8 roast potatoes, a tiny pot of mac and cheese, some very limp-looking vegetables, just really unpleasant, and a spread that adult me would now be ashamed to present to a guest. Now, Mr. Smith, I never did learn his actual first name, was just standing at the head of the table like some goddamn king. Tad leaned over to me and whispered to make sure that I referred to his dad as sir and always made eye contact if I spoke to him, and only to speak to him if he spoke to me first. I genuinely felt like this was some type of prank at first, but it was very clear from the atmosphere that this was not. Now, Mr. Smith did not greet me or introduce himself. He gave me a sort of nod and then continued to acknowledge that I was there. I was seated to his left, Tad opposite me, and then the little sister sat next to Tad and Mrs. Smith sat opposite her. And this positioning is important for later because you need to know that I was in reach of Mr. Smith. And so I followed the lead of the others and stood behind my chair while Mr. Smith spouted a rambling, droning grace that seemed to last forever. And weirdly, too, at no point did he actually mention God or Jesus or anything. It was just about giving thanks and appreciating the things we have. But it wasn't directed at anyone or any particular deity. Now, I didn't really notice this at the time, but looking back, it seemed incredibly odd. Anyway, we finally sat down, and Mr. Smith cut the turkey and started piling it on his plate, and I sort of loosely reached out for a roast potato. Now, without warning, without a word, Mr. Smith backhand slapped me across the face. I was absolutely speechless. It hadn't been hard enough to really hurt or anything, it was just hard enough and belittling enough to leave my face red, both from the slap and the embarrassment of being pimp slapped by my friend's parent. Like, holy crap, I had never in my entire life been struck by a friend's parent before, and certainly not when I was old enough to be in high school. Mrs. Smith quickly stepped in and told me in a very trembling voice that it's custom to allow the man of the house to dish out his entire portion before anyone else was allowed to take any food. Mr. Smith then added very sternly that usually the man of the house would eat his entire portion before the rest of the family could eat either, but they were making an exception because they had guests who did not seem to understand respect. I wasn't a particularly angry or petulant child, but I was burning with fury inside. Tad kept giving me these looks like I was supposed to understand what was going on here, but I just didn't. I was too scared to take any food at this point, and I had to be prompted by Mrs. Smith to help myself eventually. And when I did, I was horrified. The food had looked unappetizing, but it was worse than it seemed. Everything was lukewarm at best. The vegetables were undercooked. The pasta and the mac and cheese were crunchy from being underboiled. And worst of all, the turkey was pink and slimy, perhaps the most undercooked meat I'd ever encountered in my life. And the rest of the family were picking at their food as if they were aware of how vile it was, but Mr. Smith was devouring his portion with almost a sort of gusto, for lack of better words. And not once did he praise the chef, though, which I'm certain was Mrs. Smith, because I can't imagine Mr. Smith being the type of man who did the cooking. Now, about halfway through the meal, the undercooked and horrifically prepared food began to take its own toll on my sensitive stomach, and I felt serious, unpleasant pains coursing through me. I tried masking it, pushing my food around on my plate with my fork, but Mr. Smith noticed and told me to eat up, son. It's impolite to be ungrateful to one's host. And I finally spoke up and said that I had a really bad stomach ache, and could I please call my parents to come get me because I didn't want to ruin their Thanksgiving dinner. Now Tad, Mrs. Smith, and the little sister all went totally pale and silent at this. Mr. Smith's face went a sort of shade of crimson, and I swear, if this had been a cartoon, steam would be bursting out of his ears. Unfortunately, this was real life. It was my life. "How dare you," he screamed, and then proceeded to lecture me on how I was the rude, uncouth little deviant. And then he turned his sights on Tad. It was Tad's fault for inviting someone like me from the wrong side of the tracks to their family meal. And Tad began apologizing profusely, saying that I didn't know any better, and of course I would stay and finish my meal. And I felt so betrayed. But then I kind of realized why Tad had no choice. Mr. Smith stood up, dragged Tad to his feet, and proceeded to force him over his knee, pull his pants down, thankfully not his underwear, and spanked him with such violence that I'm amazed Tad didn't burst into tears. Mr. Smith then looked at me, and it was a very clear threat. Either I play ball or Tad would suffer the brunt of my actions. So I forced the rest of my food down, struggling against stomach pains, struggling not to throw up, and struggling not to burst into tears when I thought about my own family and the absolute hell it must be living with this one. And eventually dinner was finished, and in silence we ate some type of sort of slimy jello with some fruit in it. And as soon as dessert was finished, Mr. Smith promptly commanded that I leave and to think on my actions that night and the shame that I brought on myself and my family. It was an hour's way back to my house, and I opted to just take it rather than dare ask if I could call my parents. Now, when I got home, our own Thanksgiving meal was still underway, and Mom and Dad just cheerfully asked me if I wanted to join in. And I kind of snapped at them, burst into tears, and then ran upstairs and threw up. And I spent the next 3 days bedridden with this food poisoning, during which time I explained to my parents as best I could exactly what had happened that night. And when I got to the part about Mr. Smith slapping me, I could see Dad starting to shake with rage. But then my parents surprised me by saying that different families just have different customs and values, and that I shouldn't hold it against Tad, and I should continue to be his friend. I just shouldn't visit his house anymore. Now, I'd expect something else, I guess, some kind of confrontation where my dad, my hero, had gone around to the Smiths and given Mr. Smith a beatdown. Instead, it felt a bit like an anticlimax. Then, 6 months later, Mr. Smith abandoned his family, just upped and disappeared. And rumors spread around town that he'd run away with some lady of the night from the local strip club. All sorts of gossip spread about him, and things that would have made it very hard for Smith to show his face around town again. Talk of inappropriate behavior with the young boys he coached at Little League. Local cop friends of my dad claiming that Mr. Smith was a known curb crawler in the red light district. All sorts of things. And as soon as Smith abandoned his family, Tad really came into his own. We'd stayed friends, just like my parents had asked of me, and Tad went on to go from class clown to actually valedictorian, and he spent every Thanksgiving with my family after that. And when it came to his turn to give thanks, he'd always say that he was thankful for whatever caused his dad to show his true self. And whenever Tad would say that, my own dad would give me a look and a bit of a wink, and I never asked him about it. I never wanted to know. I knew enough to know that Smith was still alive, at least, and throughout the years, he made a few attempts to contact Tad, usually begging for money, and Tad and I are still great friends. He always ignores his dad pleading, and he especially ignores it when his dad mentions the ultimatum that he was given back then, which forced him to leave his family. And Tad doesn't want to know what that means, and neither do I. But all I know is that sometimes people do get what's coming to them, and for that, I'm thankful as all heck. So I've been a head loss prevention officer at my local ASDA for close to 20 years by this point, and I've seen some wrong-uns on both sides of the fence, let me tell you. There was a shoplifter, big buff tattooed bloke who would only nick scented candles, and then there was the young lad on the checkout who played five-a-side with us who turned out to be pretty weird with kids. Now none of them hold a torch to Nick though. Nick made Gary Glitter look like a decent bloke. Well, maybe not quite that extreme, but he was certainly a massive C-word who I would not shed a tear for if he unalived his own life, as the talk tick kids might say. And so Nick was the most zealous loss prevention officer I've ever met. This was mostly a good thing for lads like me who take the job seriously with military precision. If anyone swiped a jar of Marmite or a pack of crumpets, Nick would be on them like flies on poo. Like he'd frog march them off to the security office, and then he'd spent around half an hour in there, and I swear down that that person would never shoplift again. Now, I'd never heard any complaints about Nick. Not one, but I guess it turns out, when you scare people into silence, they don't tend to complain about you. To this day, I do not know what Nick said or did to persuade the guy to go straight. For all I know, it was the same thing. But when I found out that he was persuading the young girls to go straight, well, it made me sick to my stomach. It was a total idiotic coincidence how I caught Nick at it, though. I was in the security office and I managed to get myself locked in the security closet. Don't ask me how. To this day, I couldn't explain it. Fate, maybe. And so Nick brings this girl in, maybe 18 or 19, and immediately he's explaining to her how he's not just a security guard, he's secret police. And then he flashes some kind of badge which I couldn't make out through the slats in the door, but I guess it was pretty convincing because the girls start crying and begging and apologizing. And so Nick tells her that he's only pulled her aside because, get this, she's a suspected enemy of the state. Apparently there are things that flag up to his people and he has to pay extra special attention to them. He's implying to this last that his people would be capable of disappearing her unless she cooperated. Nick's idea of cooperation was, to put it mildly, obscene, and the way he explained it, the items she was stealing, in this case bread, tomatoes, and beans, was a code combination for other agents to know that she was strapped with explosives. It was clearly some absolute nonsense, but long story short, he could make any trouble go away if she let him take some shots of her without clothes to prove that she's not wired or strapped with explosives. Now, I have no idea if this girl believed him, but she certainly believed that she could avoid escalation if she just did what he said and stripped off for him. And so I was there stuck in the damn closet while he persuades this girl to explicitly make it clear that she's not wearing a wire. Now, had this been how he'd achieved such a high record of handling shoplifters, did he basically just blackmail them to strip down for him in exchange for turning a blind eye? Was the bizarre secret agent aspect some twisted gimmick? Did anyone fall for it? Did any of this matter? Not me. I saw red and managed to kick the closet door open, catching Nick in the act of taking a horrifically explicit shot of this girl bent over the table while she was crying and apologizing. Now, I have a daughter. All I could see was red, and I didn't care if this was his first time or his 50th. I was going to drive Nick away in the same way that he'd been dealing with shoplifters. I told the girl to get dressed and get out of there, and ask her to trust me that I'd deal with Nick if she didn't call the cops. But I didn't hold back. I gave Nick the beating of his life, and then forced him to strip in the way he'd forced that girl, and who knows how many others, and I took photos. Now, none of this was sensible. I'm not proud of it. Now, I should have reported him, but sadly, I know how impossible it can be to achieve justice for crimes like this. And so giving Nick a beating he'd never forget and lowering myself to his level, maybe it wasn't right, but it felt like the best option I had. Finally, I told him if he ever quit the job while I was there, if he prevented me from being able to keep a close eye on him, I would find him, and I would make him regret ever trying to avoid me. I told him I had him by the short and curlies, and I'd never be letting go. And if I ever found out that he'd been up to his old tricks, his life would not be worth living. I guess men like him are cowards, because he believed me, and to this day I still work with him. Maybe I should have reported him, but I have no idea who his victims were, no idea if they'd play ball, and I figured that it would be better that I kept an iron vice grip on his. So this story happened on a Black Friday. The sun had just set and the bargains had been bought, and the nearby Target, in my mind, was a war zone. I did not envy the folks who'd be on cleanup duty the next day, and for me, though, it wasn't a problem. I was the manager of a gas station. We didn't have to worry about Black Friday all that much. We just had to make sure that we had enough hot dogs on the griddle, nudie magazines on the shelves, and Baja Blast in the cooler and the shotgun loaded behind the counter. It was just me and Bad Charlie, one of my coworkers. He was called Bad Charlie on account of his brain being bad. Now, nowadays, you probably wouldn't call him that, but it's how Bad Charlie, who was a sweetheart, liked to introduce himself. Now, Bad Charlie was mopping the floor, and I was kind of just deliberating over whether it was time to toss the hot dogs onto the roller. And it was. And then an old fellow approached me as I was getting the garbage bag to toss away the wieners, and then he says something like, "You tossing them, pal?" So I said yes, and he asked if maybe he could have a few. And so I respond, "Sure, do you want them with buns?" And then he says, "Yeah, that's how you do a hot dog." Now, it was a bit sassy for my taste, but whatever, so I just let him take a few hot dogs, direct him to the condiment station, and then go back to doing some admin on the old Windows ME computer that we had back then. You might remember it. Now, around 10 minutes later, Bad Charlie comes up to me and kind of tugs my sleeve, saying, "Hey, we got a problem." And there's always some problem with Charlie. Usually he saw an adorable mouse and wants to make sure it doesn't get hurt or some nonsense like that. But this time, he had a point. The old guy had made his hot dogs, but created an absolute apocalypse of sauce over at that condiment station. It looked like someone had exploded over there. And considering Bad Charlie had just spent half an hour cleaning up the condiment station, he was a little upset. And so was I, considering that the hot dogs had been a freebie for this old idiot. Now, I assumed that he'd made his mess and long since gone, but it turned out that he was still there, and in fact was storming up to the counter, one hot dog in each hand. "These doggies be some steaming pile of overcooked shiznay," the old man drawled up. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, they were old hot dogs that I was about to throw out, and he asked if he could have them for free. And Bad Charlie was asking me about what he was talking about, and I didn't really care to explain to him. I just told the old guy that if he wasn't happy with his dogs, then he's welcome to provide me with his receipt, and I'll get right on that refund. "Refuse this," he yells, hurling the hot dogs at me. Now, one misses, splattering the "Hang in there" poster in the back, which is a zombie dangling from a noose, and the other dog hits me square in the face, sending the condiments dripping down my cheeks and the wiener landing at my feet. Now, I'm too shook and kind of amused to really react, but Bad Charlie is not. He grabs the old man by the shirt and starts yelling how that ain't very nice and you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. Now, before any drama can unfold, the front door bursts open and some woman rushes in holding an expensive-looking MP3 player in its box. Now, she's yelling that she needs help because she bought the last cheap iPod at the Black Friday sale, and now there are customers after her, and could she please hide out there until they go away? Now, normally I would say yes, but the angry hot dog guy is still present, so I don't really want to seal the gas station with this dude inside, and so Charlie seems to have an idea. He grabs the old man, drags him to the front door, and throws him outside, and then yells something like, "This guy's stolen the lady's iPod, someone help her!" Now, immediately, about 5 or 6 people come running from the direction of that target towards the old hot dog dude. Now, he has no choice but to flee as Charlie locks the door, and we stand and watch as the angry customers chase that dude off without the iPod off into the darkness. I go and clean up, while Charlie explains the situation to the lady with the iPod. She's extremely grateful and explains that she genuinely believed that the other customers intended to do her serious harm if we hadn't directed them away. Part of me felt bad that we'd endangered the old dude with the hot dog, but the part that still had sauce dripping down my face didn't feel too guilty, and that he'd have to outrun an angry mob. It just goes to show that sometimes charity will get you nowhere, and simply achieving good luck will be enough to make people want to hurt you. On the plus side, Bad Charlie had an opportunity to feel like a hero, so things could have been a lot worse. All in all, not the worst Black Friday I've had, but that's a story for another time. You probably never think it to look at me today, but I used to be a pretty cool guy back when. These days, I make a living fixing cars and motorcycles, partly on the back of skills that I picked up in my former life as the guitarist in a touring rock and roll band. Now, we never made it big or anything. We didn't sell out stadiums or earn a platinum record. But we made enough money selling tapes and t-shirts and merchandise and tickets to our shows to earn a pretty decent living for ourselves. Now, we were based out of Boston and played a lot of shows in New York and Philly, but we also played all over the country too, doing that old school touring schedule thing of planning conquests with nothing but a map and a phone book. And that's how we ended up doing a kind of Rocky Mountain rock and roll tour during the summer of 1977, one that took us through Utah, Wyoming, and most relevant to this story, Colorado. And so we managed to book ourselves onto the bill of a music festival in a little mountain town called Lake City. It was a bit of a family affair, so we played a couple of Gordon Lightfoot and Neil Diamond numbers, along with a couple of the softer tunes. Now, it was light duty, as my World War II vet dad used to say, and we were still working, but it was also a chance to relax and recharge our batteries a little before the heavier shows up in Aspen and Boulder and Denver started. Now, we finished our set at around 5:30 and then walked around talking to the locals and enjoying their hospitality. I have myself a little green chili bison burger, a delicacy that no other burger has managed to top, by the way, while our bassist, this crazy SOB, ate a whole plate of Rocky Mountain oysters all to himself, much to the amusement of the locals, it would seem. And if you don't know what those are, boy, do I envy you. Now, one of the folks we got to talking to was a man named Jed, who was particularly pleased with us thanks to our cover of If You Could Read My Mind, which he said was his and his wife's song. Now, we got to talking about some of the other music we like to play, and at the mention of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, he joked about us being a band of traveling Satanists. He knew all the panic surrounding metal was bullcrap and remembered when the release of Psycho back in 1960 had folks saying society was quote-unquote going to hell. He even said he took his teenage son to see Carrie during Thanksgiving weekend of that previous year, and as a huge fan of The King, we quickly established a mutual love of all things creepy. Now, maybe an hour or two later, Jed said that he had to jet, but before he did, he asked if we'd be interested in seeing a genuine ghost town named Carson before we left for our next stop. Now, we were pretty thrilled at the idea because doing cool stuff like that was half the reason we went on tour in the first place. We didn't just get to play shows and make money, we got to see America too. And I'd say that there were few things all 5 band members could get excited about, like the idea of seeing a real-life ghost town. We met up with Jed bright and early the next morning, and then we followed his car up a bunch of gravelly mountain tracks till we eventually reached a dead end. Jed apologized and said that we'd have to walk about a mile up the mountain to get to Carson, but we didn't mind at all. It was actually kind of nice to be able to stretch our legs after spending so long on the bus. And then after a short walk through a whole bunch of trees, we entered a clearing that had around a dozen wooden buildings, all standing, derelict. Now, Jed told us Carson was founded back in 1889 as a silver mining settlement, and that for a few years it was home to almost 500 miners, as well as around half a dozen families who sold them food and equipment and laundry services. The town prospered for a few years, with a few extra bunkhouses being built to accommodate even more of those miners. But by 1895, not a single soul remained, and Carson had been completely abandoned. And when we asked what happened, Jed told us that there were 2 explanations, the official one and the unofficial one. The official one had been propagated by the town's owner and financier, who tried selling the land because the silver mine had supposedly run dry. But the unofficial explanation, which Jed says was the God's honest truth, had been passed by word of mouth from generation to generation, and this one was considerably creepier. Jed said that he'd heard the tale from his grandfather, who in turn had heard it from a lady who used to live up in Carson with her family. Jed's grandfather was a deputy sheriff, a man who could smell a lie the way other men could smell pie baking in an oven, and his grandpa believed every single word that lady had to say. He hadn't just heard it from her either. He said he met a handful of others who claimed to have been there that day. Some said a riot erupted up there in the mine and that the company's armed guards had to step in to put it down with lead. But the girl Jed's grandfather spoke to, her pa had actually gone up to the mine and seen the aftermath with his own 2 eyes. He said it was just some miners' strike that turned violent. It had been an all-out slaughter, with every man for himself. And the folks in Carson realized what was going on when a couple of wounded miners came running into town. They'd already heard gunshots echoing down the mountainside, but seeing as they relied on hunters and trappers for all their fresh meat, they didn't think much of it. But when those first miners came running into town, with cuts and stab wounds and riddled with buckshot, they sure as heck thought something of it then. Half the mining company's guards were off duty, either sleeping in the bunkhouse or drinking in the canteen. But when they heard how a bunch of miners had suddenly and unexpectedly started attacking their fellow workers and had even managed to overpower the on-duty guards, they grabbed their guns and ran up the mountain to assist them. And as more and more miners came limping down the mountain, the families living in Carson began tending to the wounded as best they could. They waited for the guards to come back, having put down the men responsible for starting the riot. But just like Jed said, it was no ordinary riot. And then when the gunfire stopped and no one came back down the mountain, some of Carson's menfolk ran up the slopes to see what had happened. But when they arrived, what they saw terrified them. There were dead bodies laying all around the mine's entrance, some belonging to miners and some belonging to guards. It made for a terrible scene, but it was nothing compared to what waited for them inside the mine. From the mine's entrance all the way down to its pit, the dead and dying lay side by side in puddles of each other's blood. Jed was told that in some sections, the blood ran down the shaft in little rivers as pools of it higher up began to overflow and run down the passageways. And there must have been at least 100 dead miners and another 50 on death's door. So as fast as they could, Carson's men began carrying the wounded out of the cave to be treated by the camp's doctor. And Jed said that he was told how awful the wounds were. Some men had been shot point blank with 12-gauge shotguns, meaning whole limbs had been blown off, and in other cases, whole torsos had been torn open and shredded. But the wounds inflicted by pickaxes were just as gruesome. Some men were completely impaled, handles hanging from their fronts with the point of pickaxes emerging from their backs. Others had their skulls completely annihilated, and in some cases, a dead man's only wound was a gaping hole in the top of his skull. It was a bloodbath, the worst thing any of Carson's men had ever seen, and they'd lived through half a dozen Rocky Mountain winters, 2 bear attacks, and even an attack by a gang of outlaws. They've seen some stuff in their time driving their wagons out east and living up in those mountains, but nothing like what they saw in that mine that day. Miners were dying just because they couldn't get help fast enough. The men would carry them out and they'd seem in pain but otherwise fine. Then when they got back to them after seeing to those who were more severely wounded, the men had bled to death. It was awful, but the killing wasn't over. Not yet. As the men are clearing out the wounded, they have to go deeper and deeper into the mine, and then at one point, the son of the town butcher went running down into the mine to go get some help, but he never came back. And when his father went down to look for him, he found his boy with a pickaxe in his hands, hacking up corpses so furiously that he was completely covered in their blood. His father tried to stop him, but the boy attacked him, and no matter how much his father tried, the boy wouldn't stop. And in the end, the butcher had to put his own son down to keep him from hurting anyone else. And then he came out of that mine screaming and insane with grief. And that's when they made the decision to seal the place up. And after gathering up as much dynamite as they could, the walking wounded were able to blow the entrance and bury both the dead and the wounded alike. There were rumors that seeing all that death made the boy go crazy, that his mind just couldn't handle it, and it slipped away from him as he walked among the dead with the coppery stink of fresh blood in the air. But those that were there say that there was something down there, maybe some kind of gas or fungal spore that was to blame for making some of the miners turn on their comrades. It happened to the butcher's boy, and he himself got a dose when he was down there to look for his son, because all he could do was scream and cry and struggle as his friends and family tried to keep him still. He wasn't just out of his mind with the grief, there was something else affecting him, something the survivors thought best to bury. Jed said the mining company paid to have all the bodies collected and returned, but they fired the survivors and tried to have them imprisoned for blowing their minds sky high. The company thought they got everybody's body off that mountainside, but Jed said that he knew of people that had found bones in the woods below the mine. Not animal bones either, human bones. He actually asked if we wanted to go look for ourselves because there was a slim chance that we might even find a souvenir, as he put it. But we told him we were good and had seen all we needed to. If there was anywhere on Earth that was genuinely haunted, it was that old mining town, and we didn't want any of those old ghosts putting a curse on our tour because we'd been dumb enough to go off with some of those bones. And Jed laughed at that, and we did too, but it wasn't entirely a joke, not in my case anyway. We called it quits not long after, and then we're back on the road and headed for Aspen. We had Lake City and Carson in our rear view, but Jed's story stuck with me for the whole rest of the tour. It stuck with me so much that when we got back home, I rented a book from the Boston Library about mining disasters. Now, it made for obviously a terrifying read, and I learned that there's a gas called hydrogen sulfide, and it's something miners called stink damp, which is known to have a narcotic effect in certain doses. It is possible that the men at the mine's deepest point were suddenly exposed to high levels of this stink damp, at which point they lost their minds. And the rest of the massacre could possibly be explained by a kind of herd mentality or collective panic whereby confused and frightened men were gripped by a sort of primal kill or be killed mentality. But the thing I've never been able to figure out is why the guards turned on each other too. Jed said it appeared as if the company guards, the ones who'd been off-duty and stationed in town, had begun attacking each other during the final stages of the massacre. And to me, that suggests something other than narcotic gases were to blame for what had happened. I've often wondered what the real cause was, but there also comes a point where I tell myself to stop thinking about it because the things my imagination starts to dream up can really start to frighten me. I didn't grow up wanting to be a coroner. No kid does, I guess, really. I actually wanted to be a doctor, but since I didn't have the grades for medical school and I still wanted to turn my love of anatomy into a career, I decided being a coroner was my best bet. Now, for those that are unaware of what a coroner does, I'll just break it down Barney style. Whenever someone dies, and we aren't super duper sure how they died, it's my job to take a look under the hood, as we say, and figure it out. I used to work in the city, and for quite a while too, but I feel like a man in my line of work can only work in a city for so long before he either quits, moves elsewhere, or loses his mind completely. Me, I decided to move elsewhere, somewhere quiet and calm, which is how I ended up in Polson, Montana. It's a pretty little town on the edge of a bay, and with just 5,000 people living here, it's considerably quieter than my previous home of almost 4 million. Now back there, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for me to complete 3 or 4 post-mortems in a 24-hour period. Now, I'm lucky if I see maybe 3 or 4 a year. And as you can probably imagine, that suits me just fine considering that I only took a minor salary hit. But then I guess, ironically, it's here that I performed the most memorable autopsy of my entire career. And it's one of those that's memorable for all the wrong reasons and why I sent you the story. Now, one morning, I got a call from a deputy sheriff to tell me that a young girl had passed away, and from the moment I heard his voice, I knew that this one was going to be different. She'd been found the previous night, wandering on the 35 in her bare feet. The driver that spotted her turned around to see if she needed any help, and found a young girl on death's door. She looked terrible, starved and beaten, and was mumbling all kinds of gibberish till she eventually passed out. The driver tried to keep her awake and talking, and then when he realized that she was probably slipping away, he even tried performing CPR. But unfortunately, The poor thing passed away before the emergency crews could get to her. Naturally, the sheriff's department wanted to know exactly what killed her. But more importantly, they wanted to know if I thought that there was also a who element to it, as in, was it a tragic accident or was it murder? But when the girl's body arrived at my office, I found that there were many more questions to be asked, and some very frightening ones too. And when it came time for the autopsy, the forensic pathologist I work with agreed that he'd never seen anything like it. At 5'7", the girl appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, but she didn't weigh an ounce over 70 pounds. She was also this very sick shade of yellow, which indicated liver and kidney failure, but that wasn't even the half of it. She'd quite clearly been starved, and her body was so heavily covered in burns and scars that it seemed her abuse had been almost systematic, like someone had been trying to slowly disfigure her, one patch of flesh at a time. We discovered the girl's eyes had actually been gouged out, and that her finger and toenails appeared to have been completely and deliberately removed. There was also evidence someone had tried to either torture or sterilize her by piercing her abdomen with some hot wires or needles. The technicians collected swabs and samples, and then the pathologist proceeded to cut that old distinctive Y shape into the chest of the deceased. And the effects of her starvation were evidence of the girl's organs, yet bizarrely we found quite a sizable amount of partially digested organic material in her lower digestive tract. Now, this, along with samples of her blood and spinal fluids, was tested at our on-site laboratory, and what our technicians found was truly shocking. The contents of the girl's stomach turned out to be a mix of two very distinct varieties of fungi, fly agaric and the suitably named death cap. Now, the death cap needs no introduction, as I'm sure you know. It does what its name suggests. Some might say that fly agaric is also suitably named because while ingesting it won't make you fly, it does have intense hallucinogenic effects on those who use it. The implications of its presence terrified us. And when it came to writing up the post-mortem, we almost didn't want to believe our own conclusions. Judging from the bruises around her wrists, ankles, and neck, someone had kept the girl prisoner, and the level of starvation suggested this had been for a considerable amount of time. During this period, she had been systemically tortured and maimed by someone exceptionally sadistic. Then, once she was hungry enough to eat just about anything put in front of her, the girl's captor fed her a fatal mix of mushrooms and just let her go. Even if she was still in possession of her sight, we judged the girl was far too weak to have mounted any kind of serious escape attempt. So either something inconceivable occurred and she wandered free from captivity, or her captor deliberately set her free. She spent her final hours wandering through the woods in what must have been complete confusion and unimaginable agony. It was the single most horrifying post-mortem I've ever had the displeasure of overseeing, but it raised the question, just who the hell was evil enough to inflict such an ordeal on an innocent young woman? Once our examination was complete and the final report written up, the girl's body was transported to a local funeral home. Our official conclusion was that the girl had been murdered via poisoning, and there were comorbid factors of starvation and historical physical abuse. And this led to a murder investigation being opened, but sadly, it's one that's never been closed. I've overseen many, many postmortems in my time as a coroner, and there have been more memorable ones that I care to count. But not one of them haunts me, and I mean truly haunts me like that poor young woman who spent her final few hours on this earth blind, terrified, and wandering around alone in the middle of nowhere. When I was 28 years old, I was still living in Denver, and a few friends and I went out for dinner and drinks. It was fun at first, but as the sun went down and the alcohol started to flow, I realized that I just wasn't feeling it. I had really gotten into yoga, running, and eating healthy that summer, so even though staying out late and partying was still fun, I just didn't have the energy for it anymore. I stayed for one last drink before saying goodbye to my friends and then walked outside to catch a cab. And then as I was waiting, I heard a man's voice off to the right of me asking, "Are you waiting for a cab too?" And that is how I met Patrick. It turns out we're in very similar situations. He'd been out celebrating his brother's birthday, but had quit drinking a few years back. And so before everyone got too drunk and too annoying, he figured that he'd head home to save himself the headache. Now, I like the idea of a guy who didn't drink, so after establishing that we were both single and of similar ages, I began to drop some not-so-subtle hints that he should ask for my number. We were having such fun flirting that we almost didn't notice when an empty cab drove right past us. And then when the next one came around, Patrick insisted that I be the one to take it. Now, he was a gentleman, and he was handsome, and he was charming. So when he texted me about grabbing some coffee sometime, you can bet that I texted back. We dated for 2 years and fell deeply in love with one another. He was the ideal partner, except for one tiny peccadillo: his past. Now, I know in literally any other circumstance a guy not being frank about his history is a huge red flag, but Patrick wasn't entirely opaque. He talked about high school, he talked about climbing the career ladder in his 20s, and he was willing to be frank about past relationships too. The other thing he wasn't so open about was college. He said his first 2 years were basically non-stop partying, and it got so bad that he had to repeat a few courses during his sophomore year. He talked about falling in with a pretty bad crowd and how he had to cut himself off from them just to get his degree. And I could tell that he was embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed, so I didn't push him on it. I just liked that he'd changed. And then one day, Patrick asked me to go hiking with him. Now, I was surprised because Patrick was just about the least outdoorsy type of guy you could imagine. He worked out, but he loved the indoor gym that he was a member of, and he was way more interested in gadgets and gizmos than the natural world. So when he asked me if I wanted to go hiking of all things, I was actually kind of stunned, but I was super excited. You see, maybe 6 months prior, we'd been talking about the prospect of getting married and even having children. Not so much with each other, it was just sort of a in general thing. Patrick asked what my ideal proposal location would be, and he gave me examples like the bridge in Central Park or the top of the Eiffel Tower. But after considering it, I decided I'd much rather be proposed to in a place of natural beauty rather than artificial. And I remember he nodded like, "Okay, unconventional, I like it." But I never thought in a million years he'd actually keep it in mind. So that Sunday morning when he asked if I wanted to go hiking up near Golden Gate Park that following weekend, it dawned on me how Patrick might actually be planning on proposing. And I started freaking out in text messages to friends saying that I didn't know if I was ready. Now, I mean, I wanted to marry him. I just didn't know what kind of wife I was going to be or if our relationship would survive the transition from casual to serious commitment. My friends said that I was just overthinking things and that I should just trust that initial gut feeling of excitement. It was true that realizing a proposal was on the cards had made me so very happy. So rather than continue to ruminate, I just simply waited for the date of the hiking trip. And when it came, I just knew that I was going to say yes. Now, the first 2 hours or so was just a dream. My usually outdoorsy, averse boyfriend had put a ton of effort into making sure that he had all the right equipment, and being his typical self, he brought a bunch of cool gadgets along too. Stuff like straws with built-in water filters and solar-powered phone chargers just in case we got low on battery. And the scenery was beautiful. The weather in the Rockies was great, and as Patrick guided us along the trails towards our mystery destination, I got more and more excited. And before long, he took us up the trail that wound up this very steep slope, and when we got to the top, we found ourselves at a sort of steep earthen cliff that overlooked the forest below. It was an incredible view, and knowing what was coming, I started to get a little emotional. Now, Patrick looked at me, smiling as I wiped away the tears and said, "You know what I'm going to ask you, right?" And I just laughed and said yes, expecting him to drop to one knee and produce a ring at any moment. But he didn't. Instead, Patrick started explaining how he had brought me all the way out there to propose. There was just something he needed to tell me first. Now, right away, I got nervous and Patrick could sense it. I thought that he'd try and reassure me that it wasn't anything too serious, but he didn't. He just stayed quiet until I'm saying something like, "Well, what is it?" He asked me if I loved him and if I trusted him. But when I answered yes, he didn't seem any more sure of himself. He asked if I could keep a secret, if I could keep the most important secret of his whole life, and again, I said yes. But I was wrong. Patrick began telling me how, during his second year of college, he and his frat buddies went to an off-campus party, some kind of warehouse rave type of deal. And he said this was when he and his friends were on their very worst behavior, drinking like fish and fighting like sailors, and generally causing trouble for anyone and everyone. And then at this party, he starts flirting with this girl and they head off someplace to make out. Patrick said that they made out for a while and then the girl says something like, "Come back inside and dance with me." But after he returned from what passed for a bar, the girl was gone. Now he went looking all over for her but couldn't find her anywhere. And then when he spots her, maybe a half hour later, she's completely obliterated. Patrick said that he didn't know it was liquor. It was something else like roofies, but the girl seemed on the verge of passing out. He tried to get her back to the frat house, but when she was just about conscious enough to object, Patrick didn't want to go home empty-handed, shall we say. He did look and sound like he was ashamed of himself as he said it, but Patrick admitted to taking this semi-conscious girl to some dark corner of the warehouse compound and doing stuff to her. And I guess the look of disgust on my face was plain to see because he frantically added that this was the single biggest regret of his entire life, and he explained how he wasn't that guy anymore, how it made him afraid to have daughters knowing certain kinds of men harbor some predatory instincts. And he said it was a long time ago, that he'd lived with the regret ever since, and I thought that was it. And it was only after a minute or two of just sort of processing it that I asked if he'd ever tried to find the girl and make amends for what he'd done. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't over. Patrick said when he was done, he left the girl lying there where she was. She was passed out completely by then, but all he gave a crap about was going back inside to get a drink because he was thirsty. Now, he too was highly intoxicated at this point, but he didn't use that as an excuse for his behavior. He knew how selfish it was for him to just leave her there. She could have been overdosing, or she could have choked on her own puke, but Patrick said it was a full hour before it occurred to him to go back and check on her. He said he asked his friends not to leave till he got back, and then he went out expecting to find the girl sleeping, as he put it. And yet when he got there, he found that not only was the girl awake and was somewhat more sober than before, but she remembered what he'd done to her before she passed out anyway, and she was obviously livid. She told Patrick that she was going to go to the cops because she wasn't about to let some piece of crap frat boy get away with treating her like that. I felt proud of her, and I didn't even know her, but then Patrick said something that made my blood run cold when he described how he snapped. He said he pictured his whole life unraveling and how life after prison wouldn't be worth living. He had the world at his feet, but that girl was about to yank the carpet out from under him, and he couldn't let that happen. When Patrick finally uttered the words to me, "I didn't mean to kill her," I felt my entire world crumbling around me. And it was like this out-of-body experience, watching myself from afar while my heart broke in my chest. Not just for me either, and the life I thought I was going to have. I was heartbroken for that poor girl, and just trying to do the right thing resulted in Patrick accidentally crushing her larynx. He said he just wanted to scare her at first, and then he just wanted to make the problem go away. But all that fear had him squeezing just a little too hard, and Patrick didn't realize just how much damage he was doing until he felt the girl's throat just sort of give way in his hands. He said her eyes went all wide as she tried to get air into her lungs, but she couldn't. And then maybe a minute or two later, she was dead. Patrick said he could have ran for help, but he didn't because he was scared. And instead of getting help, and once he was sure that the girl was dead, Patrick went back inside the warehouse party and asked his closest friend in the frat for one hell of a favor. It was one he granted, and then over the next couple of hours they managed to hide the girl's body someplace no one would ever find it. Patrick never said exactly where, but he kinda hinted it was some kind of state park or forest, at which point it suddenly made sense why he hated the idea of hiking. He told me he was sorry, deeply and truly sorry, and that he'd do anything to take back his mistake. But it was also a mistake committed by his old self, his younger self, and he didn't think that it was one his new self had to pay for. Patrick then asked me if I thought that was a reasonable thing to say, and I suddenly realized just how vulnerable I really was. If I said no, and that I thought that he was a murdering piece of crap, and I didn't want to marry him, what was to stop him from silencing me too? He could just shove me down the steep slope and then bash my head in at the bottom to finish me off, and no one might ever find me. I'd end up just like that girl, on a missing poster with my family wondering what the hell had happened to me, but deep down, knowing that I was gone. I knew I couldn't reject him. I knew I had to at least act like I understood. And so I underwent one of the most painfully surreal experiences of my entire life, and I pretended to be the fiancé of a murderer, someone who violates people. And I told him I agreed, that the new him shouldn't have to pay for his old crimes. I told him I wasn't about to let one shot at happiness slip through my fingers because some skank decided to run her mouth. I'm ashamed to say that I said that, but it's true. I'd have said just about anything to get out of that forest alive because I figured what I planned on really doing would justify it. I leaned into the morbid curiosity that I felt and asked if he was scared that the girl's body would end up being found, and more importantly, what was going to happen to us if he ended up getting caught. Colorado had the death penalty at the time, so as Patrick said, if he got caught, it was over for us. And then we talked about the prospect of dating again after one of us passes away. Like I said, it was surreal in the extreme, but, and this is probably going to sound insane, I felt safe with him. I thought I had him. I thought I tricked him. And then after our hike was done and we walked back to his car, I felt this rush of almost victory knowing that I'd survived. And all I had to do to ensure my continual survival was to sort of keep the act up till I could get home and call the cops. But before I could do that, all the pretending I'd done resulted in a state of almost complete nervous collapse. After getting home, I think I cried for a straight hour, and then I called my mom and cried for another hour on top of that. It was probably the worst day of my life, hands down, in terms of catastrophic mental trauma, but then once I was done crying, I'd pulled myself together and hung up on Mom and then called 911. I packed an overnight bag as I waited for them to arrive because I planned on staying with my mom for the foreseeable future after Patrick got arrested. Now, I was scared that they'd maybe let him go for some reason, be it lack of evidence or him getting bail or whatever, but it turned out that I didn't have to worry about anything like that because when the cops showed up at his place looking to talk with him, he was nowhere to be found. I talked to the Denver PD a lot in the weeks that followed, but I also ended up getting a call from 2 detectives in Arizona where Patrick went to college. They were very interested in his story because the location of the murder, along with the timing of the girl's disposal, made it easier to figure out where to look. I then also got a call from an FBI agent who asked if Patrick ever went by another name or if he ever mentioned owning a fake passport. I said no to both questions, and the agent never came out and said it, but it was kind of obvious that they thought Patrick had fled the country somehow. They just didn't know how or where he'd gone. And then the agent asked if there was anywhere in the world that I thought he might have gone, somewhere special that he might have mentioned wanting to visit. And I told them about Patrick mentioning Paris and Rome one time, but aside from that, he'd never seemed all that interested in traveling. And to this day, he's never been found. but I still hold out hope that he'll show up someplace one day and that he'll finally have to pay for what he did to that poor girl. And that's almost my ideal scenario. I open the newspaper one day and there's Patrick's face under the headline saying something like "fugitive apprehended overseas." But my nightmare scenario goes a little something like this. One day, and maybe even someday soon, I'm sitting home alone and there's a knock at my door. I go to open it, so comfortable and confident that I don't bother checking the peephole. And then when I open it, there he is. There's Patrick. And he's come to shut me up for good. You might find this a very unusual submission, but I think it's one that you and your viewers might enjoy, and while I'd prefer to remain anonymous, I can assure you that it's actually genuine. Now, without giving you my entire life story, I grew up in the United Kingdom, but my parents are Greek and Iranian. They met in London after emigrating, worked hard to make a life for themselves, and then had me. They pushed me to do well in school, consoled me when my attempts to become a footballer failed, and then were pleased as punch when I was accepted into Oxford University to study Greco-Persian history. Dad liked the idea of me staying in academia. Mom agreed, but thought that I should study medicine. Yet not long after I graduated, I got a letter from an institution known as the Government Communications Headquarters, who invited me to attend a job interview. Now, to the untrained ear, Government Communications HQ might sound rather boring, but let me assure you, it is not. That's because GCHQ is responsible for providing signals and intelligence to the government and armed forces of the United Kingdom. It was first established after the First World War, then during the Second, it worked on breaking German Enigma codes out of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. Now, getting hired by them didn't make me some glorified IT guy. It made me, for all intents and purposes, a spy. And I later found out that I'd been headhunted by the recruitment team while I was at university, partially because of my academic and sporting performance, but mainly for my language skills. I spoke a little bit of Greek, but my mom's side of the family were very involved when I was a kid, so while I wasn't completely fluent in Farsi, I knew much more than most about Persian language and culture and could easily pass as Iranian. And this made me an ideal candidate to spy on the Islamic Republic. So for the first 18 months of my career, I trained for that. But then, on a sunny afternoon, UK time, in September of 2001, 19 hijackers changed the course of history, as you know. And after the towers fell, and W told New York how the world was about to hear them, my department's focus shifted from Iran to Afghanistan. But seeing as the two countries have very similar languages, in Dari and Farsi, it made me a highly rated asset, and one that was itching to be deployed. Now, less than 2 weeks after the attacks, I was sitting in a briefing room going over the details of the assignment that I'd been given. London to Cyprus, Cyprus to Turkmenistan, and then from there, I'd transformed myself from a British civil servant to an Iranian journalist before taking a taxi over the border into Afghanistan. Now, my destination was the ancient city of Herat, where I'd gather intelligence on Taliban morale and troop numbers prior to what was undoubtedly going to be an American-led invasion. While in Herat, I learned that many Taliban fighters had been sent to the mountains around 30 miles southeast of the city. There, they were digging in, stockpiling munitions, and preparing to resist coalition forces. So, that's where I went. I was advised to hire a guide to escort me through the wilderness and towards the mountains. I didn't want to get lost, but neither did I want to attract too much attention to myself. So I hitched a ride to a small village within 2 days' walk of the mountains, then did just that. Walked. Getting up into those mountains made for the toughest hike of my life. Then following one particularly grueling climb, I was relieved to see a gently sloping valley that led deeper into the mountains. It was beautiful in its way, like a little slice of Shangri-La. But as I looked around, I suddenly spotted two men standing on a ridge some distance behind me. They were little more than specks all the way up there, but I could tell that they were watching me, and I remember thinking to myself, I'd be in a terrible spot of bother if one of those chaps had a rifle. As I walked further and further away from them, and the valley stayed nice and quiet, I started to relax. I started thinking that they were just two curious shepherds. But no sooner had that thought entered my head, the first bullet struck the rocks about 50 meters away from me. It was terrifying, impossible to put words into in a way, and I've never felt anything like it. There was nothing ahead of me but open ground, so all I could do was run as fast as I could and hope the gunman was just some goon with an AK and not an expert marksman. Because if he was, I was dead. And the first bullet landed about 50 meters away in a spray of dust and gravel, but when the second hit, it was even closer. It landed no more than 20 meters ahead of me after whizzing over my head. And the next was closer still, landing just within arm's reach. But by then, I had made it to a grouping of large rocks that I could bound between to put something solid between me and those bullets. And eventually I was faced with a stretch of open ground leading up to a gentle ridge, and I waited to see if another shot came, and then when I was met with only silence, I ran for the ridge, praying the gunman had given up and wasn't just reloading. But no more bullets were fired. It was a relief to be on the other side of the ridge, knowing I was totally out of sight, but I knew that I still wasn't safe. The gunman and his pal could be pursuing me, or there could be additional assailants waiting ahead. And with no choice, I pushed on as fast as I could until I suddenly spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't until I got much closer that I realized that it was a tea house, and that was another huge relief, because with the sun beginning to set, it was an ideal place to bed down for the night. Most Afghan tea houses serve tea and simple meals, but many feature side rooms or second floors that function as guest houses. Guests are packed into one large room with nothing but a mat to sleep on, so it's not exactly the Ritz, but they serve as a wholesome shelter for travelers during the longer, colder nights and when the passes are blocked by winter snows. I drew some stairs after making my way inside, but after the owner rather loudly asked where I was from, my cover story seemed to lessen the tension. There was a clear interest in me, but I was left to eat and drink in peace. After a few hours of nursing cups of tea and talking with fellow travelers, I approached the tea house's owner regarding accommodation for the night. I was directed to a back room where, just as I expected, several other men sat on their sleeping mats, which were placed around the room. The walls were bare, the floor was covered in a mosaic of carpets, and there was a large silver tea set in the middle of the room. But what really grabbed my attention was the Kalashnikov that sat in one man's lap. Some of the men seemed to recognize me from the tea house's main room and greeted me before telling the others who I was, or rather, who I wasn't. I ran with my cover and began asking their thoughts on Al-Qaeda, the United States, Osama bin Laden, while writing notes in Farsi shorthand on a notepad. They bought my story wholesale, and in line with Afghan hospitality customs, they promised to do their utmost to look after me during my stay. But then, after one of them asked me how my stay in Afghanistan had been, I couldn't help but mention the unfortunate shooting incident which had occurred earlier that day. Some of the men tutted and shook their heads, muttering "Badmashi," which means like criminals or gangsters. But as I described how the distant shots had come out of nowhere and I'd rushed forward into cover, I noticed the man with the gun shared a very sheepish look with another man sitting next to him. The Afghans pride themselves on being good hosts, so I initially confused the look with one of embarrassment. But when I finished my story, you can imagine my shock when the man with a rifle basically said, "Sorry, that was me." He did it in a very long-winded, very Afghan way, with a "I shot at someone today, but it couldn't have been you," becoming "It might have been you," and ending with "It was probably you, and I'm sorry." And to understand how surreal this was for me, you have to understand the manner in which this man was apologizing to me. If I almost killed a man, if I almost orphaned his children and widowed his wife, I'd beg his forgiveness. Not just because he could quite easily have me imprisoned, but because I'd have robbed him of his most precious possession, his life. But that is a very Western mindset, because there are places in the world where human life is not nearly so highly valuable. And so when I say that the man apologized to me in a way that you might do after bumping someone's trolley in a supermarket, I say it sincerely. To him, his shots didn't hit me because God didn't let them. If I was favored by God, then I must be all right. But why shoot at me in the first place? And when I asked the man, he said that it was for two reasons. The first being that I was quite obviously a foreigner. This utterly confounded me, as I'd spent months preparing and was kitted out in authentic and well-worn Afghan attire. Yet according to the gunman, he knew that I wasn't Afghan because, and these are his words, I didn't walk like it. And then since there was a good chance that I was some kind of American infiltrator, not far off, boys, the gunman decided that there was no harm in shooting at me. He says this to his companion, but his companion laughs and then says something to the effect of, "You'll never hit him at his distance, you're a terrible shot." To which he replies, "Oh yeah? Watch me." It was a bet. I was nearly shot and potentially killed over little more than a bet. The perpetrators were deeply apologetic and claimed that they'd never have shot me if they'd known that I was an Iranian Muslim. But it was still a very strange and very bitter pill to swallow that I'd nearly been killed to prevent a man losing face. And it was also a reminder that if they found out who I really was, I'd be in a hell of a lot of trouble. So instead of showing what I really felt, which was a mix of terror and relief, I acted calm as you like and told them God obviously had a plan for me. And both men were very pleased by my veneer of fatalism. But it was just that, a cover. As deep down, I was more frightened than I'd ever been in my entire life. Yet thanks to my training, I'd learned not to show it. The group and I talked until the wee small hours of the morning, and I made notes on anything and everything pertinent. The two men even offered to walk me further up the mountains so I could reach Taliban positions in safety. But I departed before the call to dawn prayers while everyone was still asleep. I reached the Taliban positions, conducted a few interviews with their lieutenants and commanders, and all without having my cover even close to being blown. And then just a few weeks later, American B-52s were dropping bombs on them, all based on my intelligence reports. And I sometimes think about that tea house and I hope it survived the American bombing. One day, God willing, I can go back there and be a traveler under some very different circumstances. For almost 2 decades now, I've worked as a helicopter pilot for Utah's Department of Public Safety. People are often surprised by what a varied job it actually is. Because while we obviously provide a lot of support to law enforcement, we also perform medical evacuations, assist with wildfire and disaster response, and most relevant to my story today, we support search and rescue operations out in the Rockies. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so sometimes I'm grabbing my gear in the middle of dinner or in the middle of the night because someone's gotten themselves into trouble in the UWC. That's the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, about 30 miles east of Salt Lake. Most of the time the calls come from hikers or climbers who get lost or hurt in the mountains, or sometimes we get skiers caught in avalanches during winter. But then other times, I find myself flying into situations that are much more unsettling than just a lost hiker or stranded skier. And the bird I fly most is the Airbus H-125, a single-engine helicopter that's ideal for flying through the Rockies. It's got enough power for high-altitude work, which is crucial around here since elevations can regularly push 10,000 feet or more during search and rescue operations. I take off from the airport in Salt Lake, and then within minutes, I'm soaring up into the mountains to link up with the ground team. The air gets thin quick, so you gotta manage your power carefully. The H-125 handles it well, but it can sometimes feel very different to flying at sea level. It's beautiful up there in the mountains, but the weather can turn on a dime. One minute it's clear blue skies, the next, you're dealing with turbulence from downdrafts off the peaks, or snowstorms that come out of nowhere and cut visibility down to nothing. But even when the weather's fine, the kind of flying they have to do up there can get real dangerous real quick. On more than one occasion, I've had to hover in tight spots, like above a narrow ridge with my rotors less than 20 feet or so from the treetops. I then have to hold that position on pain of death while the crew lowers the hoist to a stranded climber with a busted leg. Those hoists really come in handy for pulling people out of tough spots, like steep canyons or cliffs where you can't land, but they're not a fix-all. To fill the gaps, me and my crew keep the bird loaded up with stuff like night vision goggles, searchlights, and Reco detectors, a real handy piece of equipment which can pinpoint people wearing reflective clothing. Because flying SAR missions in the Utah Rockies is no joke, we need all the help we can get out there. And despite all I've said, most ops are actually pretty straightforward in terms of what we do. We spot them, drop a line, and then haul them out and crack a beer back at HQ. But there's one from a couple of years back that still has me wondering what in the world really happened out there. It started just like any other call might do, with the phone on my nightstand dragging me out of sleep. The missing man's wife had called 911 just a few hours before after her husband failed to return home following a solo hike up near Hayden Peak. I wasn't expecting anything too intense. The last couple of ops involved rescuing pencil-pushing city boys who'd bitten off more than they could chew, so I figured it might be more of the same. But after flying over the area surrounding Farm Creek Peak, we couldn't spot our hiker anywhere. The ground team was already on location, with some combing the trails on ATVs, so we decided to open up our search area to see what we could find. Eventually, we found ourselves flying over a place called Wilson's Peak, the highest point in the entire state of Utah. And the terrain up there is brutal, with sheer cliffs and deep snowpack, and since it was a long way off the area our hiker was said to be, we didn't expect to find anything. But no sooner had we gotten close enough that my pilot spotted something through thermal imaging. It was weak, but it was damn sure human-shaped, and it was up on a narrow bluff about 8,000 feet up. I banked us closer, eyes peeled, and then suddenly, there he was, the missing hiker. He was sitting near a ledge, no tent, no pack, just him in a thin jacket, limply waving one arm and looking like he'd been through hell. I radioed the ground teams, telling them that we had a visual and passing on the man's coordinates, and the ground team acknowledged and then sent ATVs in our direction. But after a tense 20 minutes of them probing the approaches, the leads come back over the radio saying the approach is iced over and far too steep. To get to the guy without putting the chopper in danger, they'd need specialists with climbing gear, which would take around 2 hours. And the trouble was, from the looks of him, I didn't think the guy had 2 hours left. Now I looked at my co-pilot and he looked at me and we both agreed, screw it. We're going in low, drop the line. And to say it was a risky move would be one heck of an understatement. Regulations say to keep a buffer for wind shear and rotor wash, but I dipped the nose and threaded the chopper between pine trees and the contour of the slope. The altimeter started yelling warnings at me as we got within 50 feet of the bluff, which was dangerously low for a winch op in such gusty conditions. My winch medic, a guy with balls of steel named Tony Reyes, clipped the winch to his rig, lowered himself onto the cable as I hovered in place, then edged across the ledge towards our missing hiker. Once he reached him, Reyes asked the guy if it was good enough to hold on to something. The guy couldn't stand, but Reyes managed to get the very unglamorously named crotch strap between his legs, and then with a little assistance, he was good to go. We couldn't linger. Fuel was burning and the winds were picking up. I spotted a flat meadow a mile down the valley, clear and flat enough to safely set down Reyes and the hiker. My co-pilot pulled the line up a little and up came Reyes and our hiker, and then off we went to gently drop them off before I set us down and we waited for the ground crew. Once our rotors were still, myself and my co-pilot hopped out to go check on the hiker. We found him propped up against a log, wrapped in foil blankets, while Reyes set up an IV, but something was off. Our hiker had been missing for less than 24 hours, but he looked gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days, and he was dehydrated to the point that his tongue was a little swollen and he had trouble speaking. Even stranger, the guy couldn't seem to remember his own name, not at first anyway. Hypothermia makes people slow, but it doesn't fog their memory, and this guy was all glassy-eyed and confused when we asked his name. He didn't say it, but we could tell that he couldn't remember. And then after maybe a minute or two, it seemed to just come back to him, like the phone number of an old girlfriend or something. And I remember kneeling down next to him and saying, "Hey buddy, what happened? How'd you end up in that?" And he broke eye contact and then stared off, kind of blinking for a second, before saying he couldn't remember. And the only things he did remember were hiking alone, realizing someone was following him, and then running to try and escape them. Then the next thing he knew, he was way up the side of the mountain, too exhausted to climb back down again. And that was it. No significant details to go on. No coherent timeline. Just he was alone, got scared, and then ran in a blind panic till he came to again. The ground team rolled up on their ATVs within maybe 10 to 15, and then the medics began swarming the guy. We waited for Reyes to finish talking to the ground team lead, hoping that the guy would get more talkative as he warmed up. But he didn't. His memory stayed foggy, and we never found out how a guy with no equipment climbed all the way up to that bluff. The paramedics chalked it up to exposure or delirium, and missing hikers often try to climb up high so aircraft can spot them and don't anticipate the nights getting fatally cold. So after they loaded him up, they took him off to the ER in Provo for treatment, saying all would make sense once the guy's memory came back to him. We wrapped the op, flew back to base, and then debriefed with all the standard paperwork. Now, we'd done our job, maybe even saved a guy's life in the process, so it should have been high fives all around after hitting the bar for celebration beers. But all we did was sit around talking about it because none of it made any sense. The bluff near Wilson's Peak was almost a day's walk from Hayden, the place the guy was reported missing. That meant that he'd hiked and climbed over 15 miles as the crow flies to get from Hayden to Wilson, which, if you know the terrain, seems next to impossible, especially at night. And then to get up the bluff that he was on, he must have truly believed that his life was in danger because I don't know if you're a climber or if any climbers are actually listening, but I'm talking class 5 scrambling against vertical faces, something any usual amateur would consider themselves incapable of. Now, this guy had no climbing gear, no experience listed in his profile, as the family confirmed that he was a casual weekend walker from the flatlands. And so in that case, how the heck did he free climb that in a panic, in snow, without breaking his own damn neck? Investigators followed up on his claims of a pursuit, but they didn't find a second set of tracks on the snows below, and there were no reports of suspicious activity from any place else in the park. The guy recovered physically and was happily reunited with his wife and kids following a brief stay in the hospital, but his memories stayed like Swiss cheese. The last thing he recalled clearly was realizing that he was being followed, and then apart from a few flashes of running, climbing, and fearing for his life, it was all dark patches. In the years since, I must have gone it over in my head maybe 100 times already, and I wonder what spooked the guy so bad that he actually turned into a damn mountain goat. And the only thing that really tracks is a bear. A big old black bear standing on 2 legs, which might have started chasing him on 4, and that's the only sight that I could figure would trigger that kind of primal fear, in which case it could have been a mama bear just taking care of her cubs. But then what if it wasn't? What if it really was a man out there lurking among the trees and waiting for some hapless hiker to come along so he could hunt them through the trees? I mean, let me know what you think, but both are scary in their own way. But it still doesn't explain the distances involved or how our hiker climbed up that bluff. And it kills me thinking I'll never find out, and it will forever remain a mystery. More than 20 years ago now, way back during the summer of 2002, I received some of the worst news of my entire life. My favorite Aunt Janie, who I'd been very close with after Mom died when I was young, had suddenly and tragically passed away. It was devastating, but perhaps even more so because it came at a very inopportune time for me. I guess no death comes as a quote-unquote good time, but Aunt Janie died as I was going through a series of bitter financial struggles. I moved across the country a few times before to pursue my dream of, I guess that's not entirely relevant, but let's just say that it wasn't going well, and I barely had 2 quarters to rub together. I couldn't afford a flight, and I really didn't want to leave my car alone for days because it had almost certainly been stolen by the time I got back. And so, not wanting to miss the funeral for fear of forever regretting it, I decided that I was going to drive almost 3,000 miles from Newark, New Jersey to my hometown of Sacramento, California. And sometimes when I look back on it, I wonder what in the world I was thinking, embarking on a 6,000-mile round trip. But at the time, it made perfect sense. I hated living in Newark so bad that I'd have done anything to get away for a while. Now, nothing against the city itself, it's not nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, but my living arrangements left much to be desired, and for multiple reasons too. I also figured that since I hadn't really seen much of the country I lived in, it was a great excuse for a road trip. Then, and this is probably the craziest part, I figured that I might buy an RV while back in California, assuming that I got some inheritance money, and I'd drive that back to Jersey instead. And like I said, I'm not really sure what I was thinking, but my idea of that road trip and the reality of it would turn out to be very different. On the 3rd day of my journey, I'd reached the western side of Wyoming. I just stopped in a little town called Lyman for a light lunch and then planned to stop for gas in a place called Evanston before crossing over into Utah. But after maybe 45 minutes of being on the highway, I spotted a small town on the horizon, one that I was pretty sure not Evanston. And I remember slowly as I reached the town limits while thinking, well, might as well top off my tank here if possible, and I started looking around for a gas station. But then, rather than wasting time driving around in circles, I figured that I'd just ask someone for directions. The place had an old-timey vibe about it, and a bunch of stores had signs that looked like they were in Swedish or maybe German. And then aside from a couple of rundown houses, it was honestly picturesque. People looked friendly, it had that wholesome small-town feel to it, so I didn't think twice about rolling down my window and asking a passerby for some pointers. Now, the first person I spotted was a middle-aged woman walking along the sidewalk carrying a few shopping bags. I called out to her, and she walked over to my window, and then after a nice welcoming to the town, she told me that the gas station was almost smack bang in the middle of things, not far from town square. I thanked her and told her how pretty her town was, and she said that I was welcome, but then as I was driving off, she did something very out of the ordinary. She pointed her fist at me, with her index and pinky fingers raised, and then said what sounded like thin and gangly. She said it with a smile, and then turned her back and walked off. So at the time, I figured it was little more than just like some harmless idiosyncrasy. And I also figured that I hadn't heard her correctly because there was no way that she said thin and gangly. It had to be something else. But then, what was up with that sort of devil horns rock gesture she made too? And as I drove toward the town square, I figured that I was probably just overthinking things. Maybe she had arthritis and couldn't make a whole fist while pointing. And then, whatever she said, the smile on her face suggested it probably wasn't mean or rude or whatever. And so with that in mind, I continued on towards the town square and the gas station. When I arrived, the gas station's pumps looked like they were from the 60s, and a smiling attendant had to walk out from the station to give me advice on how to use them. He was friendly about it, but he clearly took a great deal of amusement in seeing a millennial like me struggling to use something so outdated. Now, once I was done, I walked inside to pay him. I made a little small talk as I took my change, realizing that I hadn't seen any signage outside of town, so I didn't know what it was called. And the guy kind of chuckled, shook his head, and said, "Damned kids." But he never mentioned the town's name as he went back to reading his paper. I figured he probably wasn't the conversational type, so I just thanked him and turned and began walking back to my car. But as I did, I heard that weird phrase spoken a second time. Now, from behind me, I thought I heard the attendant say, from thin and gangly. And he said it in the same way as you'd tell someone, see you later. Now, I then said back, sorry, what did you say? But not in a sort of confrontational or demanding way. I was just sure to stay as courteous as I could. But instead of explaining himself, the guy simply said it a second time. Only that time, he said it so slowly that I could hear exactly what he was saying. Von hinnen gangen. He didn't just repeat himself, though. He said it aggressively, almost like it was a warning. And if it was a warning, it was one that I didn't need to be given twice. I walked straight back out to my car, intent on getting the hell out of town. Something weird was going on, and I suddenly felt very unwelcome. When I stopped at some lights at the edge of the town square, I noticed someone gesturing to me from the sidewalk off to my left. He was waving gently and had a smile on his face, but by then I was so wary that I wasn't convinced his intentions were pure. I waved back cautiously, and then he started moving his fist in a circle as if to say, roll your window down. I didn't roll it down completely. Like I said, I was still kind of wary, but as soon as he saw the gap in the glass, he started pointing at me with his index and pinky finger, just like that lady did before yelling out, Von hinnen gangen. I rolled my window up again, wondering what the hell I was thinking and rolling it down a little. The lights were still on red, so I had to just sit there and keep calm till they turned green. But in the meantime, the guy kept on yelling that weird phrase at me as loud as he could, and that wasn't even the weirdest part. There were people walking past him, a lot of them too, but they were either completely ignoring the guy, like he was sort of invisible or something, or they just sort of looked on and smiled at his outbursts, while some of them were even laughing to themselves as they passed. I was actually kind of dumbstruck for a second, so as the guy yelling started walking towards my window, all I could do was watch him and wonder if he was crazy or if something else was happening, something I couldn't explain so easily. But when he slammed his fist into my window, I was dragged out of that dumbstruck stupor. I began yelling at him to get the hell away from my car, but as I did, the car behind started honking since the lights had turned green. I just drove. And I'd have broken the speed limit if I wasn't certain that I'd end up getting pulled over by some weird cop who'd do who knows what, probably after yelling that weird phrase at me. And I know that's probably what you're thinking at this point. Like, why not call the cops or drive to the town's sheriff's office or police department? Well, to put it straight and simple, I was terrified. The last thing I wanted to do was hang out in a place that was just so bizarrely hostile, so I tried to flee. And so after I saw the light had turned green, I put my foot down, staying within the speed limit of course, and tried making my way to the town's western limits. I was still shaken by the guy attacking my car, but my escape was going well, so I was able to stay calm. But then as I was confident that I was going the right way, 2 teenage boys jumped out in front of my car so suddenly that I had to slam on the brakes. I yelled at them to get the hell out of the street, but then I'm pretty sure you can guess what they did next. Yeah, they pointed their fists at me in that same devil horn style salute, and then they each began yelling Von hinnen gangen. Not quite in unison, but very loudly. I remember screaming in frustration as I backed up and tried to drive around them, but then they moved aside and blocked me again. I yelled at them for a second time to move out of the way, but they just kept on yelling those damned words at me with these big crap-eating grins on their faces. I knew I'd have to turn around and find another way out of town. I just couldn't run those boys over either. I wanted to, don't get me wrong, but you see my point. But then as I looked behind me to check if the street was clear, I saw a third boy running at my driver's side window, and he's carrying this big old stick in his hands. I knew what he was about to do with it, so I did my best to speed up my attempts to turn around. But I was too slow, and he was too quick. But he wasn't just quick. That kid was strong too, because when he sent that stick smashing into my window, it caused the glass to actually crack in a spiderweb pattern. Now I screamed, and the boys laughed, and then honestly I didn't try to run them over, but they were forced to duck out of the way as I put my car into drive and put my foot down again. They didn't just quit it either. They chased my car, running as fast as they could until I reached the town limits, and I kept looking up into my rear view, watching them run right down the middle of the street. A couple of grown-ups were walking around, but they didn't seem to pay any attention at all to those boys as they ran screaming behind my car. I distinctly remember yelling, "What the F is wrong with this town?" as I finally hit the open highway, trying desperately to stop from breaking down completely. And I think I lasted about 5 or 6 miles tops before I pulled over to the side of the road and burst into tears. It took a while before I was calm enough to drive again, but then I got back on the highway and I realized that I wasn't where I thought I was. It took a while to actually orientate myself, but when I did, I managed to get back on the road to Evanston. When I arrived about an hour later, I stopped and checked a map to see where the sheriff or police department was. I didn't want to ask any more strangers. I didn't want to risk it. I drove to the police department, and then after arranging to talk with an officer, he led me to some kind of interview room where I told him the whole story. I actually tried to omit the little detail about them shouting weird phrases at me because I knew that would just make me sound crazy. But even so, the way I described the town and the way its people acted towards me, it had the officer raising his eyebrows on more than one occasion. When I was done, and I was practically begging him to do something, he asked if I was okay to wait for a while because he needed to go talk to the chief. I got ready to wait for a while, because stuff like that nearly always takes an annoyingly long amount of time, at least in my experience. But then no more than 5 minutes went by before the chief appeared in the department's waiting area and asked if he could speak with me. Now, I could tell just from the way he greeted me that it wasn't going to be good news, but hearing it was surreal to say the least. The chief said I wasn't the first person to fall afoul to what he called Germantown, and I probably wouldn't be the last either, because hating and shunning outsiders was practically a proud old tradition over there. And I told him about the weird phrase they'd been yelling, the von hinnen gangen, which turned out to be some sort of archaic German way of saying, "get the hell out of here," as well as the attacks. The chief said that I was lucky not to get worse, because he'd known folks to need medical treatment after accidentally driving through there. Germantown wasn't the place's actual name, its occupants called it something else. But the whole being mean to outsiders thing started way back in the 1800s, I guess, after someone brought some plague into the town. They were already super old school religious and had a lot of superstitions, so after that it became tradition to just sort of shoo away outsiders. I asked if it had happened before, and worse too. Why hadn't anything been done about it? I thought the answer would be a complicated one, but it wasn't. Because all it boiled down to was a small town banding together and putting up a wall of silence. The most the county had ever been able to pin on anyone was a disorderly conduct charge, because local law enforcement essentially refused to do anything about crimes perpetrated on outsiders. I could try to gather evidence for litigation, but without witnesses, there wasn't a case. And so according to the police chief there, the best thing that I could do for myself was to get in my car, keep on driving to wherever I was going, and just try to forget it ever happened. Now, anything else would only bring on more trouble. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, call me naive, but I thought that there was a common law in this country that meant that people couldn't just get away with stuff like that. But obviously I was wrong. The chief said everyone in Evanston always avoided Germantown like the plague, or if they did drive through it, they made damned sure not to do so with a low gas gauge, and they never, ever stopped. Now, I made it to my aunt's funeral, but I never did buy that RV. I ended up flying back to Newark, grabbing my things, and then flying back to Sacramento to live with my dad. There's a whole other story to that, but let's just say that what I experienced in Germantown had me reassessing what was important in life. We kind of normalize cities as being dangerous places, or just accept certain neighborhoods or streets being tantamount to a sort of no-go zone. And I guess I didn't realize that that same thing applies to small towns, in the middle of nowhere, too. One morning, way back in October of 2007, a retired day hiker was trekking up the North Lateral Moraine Trail when he came across a shallow karst cave system just off the beaten path. He claimed to have interest in what he called pioneer relics, Things like rusted tin cans and shattered crockery left behind from the old covered wagons which used to snake through the front range. And so he made a habit of shining his flashlight into the darkness and looking around for old artifacts. But what he found that day was no antique. He found bones, human bones, and said that they were scattered around the cave floor and looked old, bleached, and white. And he thought that they were just animal bones at first, but then he found the skull. He told the dispatcher that he realized that it was a skeleton, maybe one left over from the Donner Party or at least some other tradition of the sea type situation. And he said they looked 100 years old, but he was wrong. And the person that proved him wrong was me. Whenever anyone finds human remains and they're not fresh, medical examiners like me get a call. And it's our job to head out to wherever the remains are found and give our expert opinion on how and why their owner passed away. Most of the time, we just simply drive over to the location of the remains and then drive back to the office once we're done. But on this occasion, since the remains were found way up in the Rockies, we were flying in by helicopter. We arrived around midday. Myself, a tech from the CBI lab in Greenlee, a photographer from the coroner's office, and a couple of rangers from the Park Service to keep the area secure. It took a while, but we eventually found the cave the hiker had referred to, which was more like a crack in the granite. And then we suited up in these Tyvek, those sort of white suits that you see in CSI, and then we flicked on our headlamps and entered the cave to lay out a 10 by 10 meter baseline. Now, what struck me initially was that the remains were partial, meaning that it wasn't a complete skeleton. We found things like a detached mandible, fragments of a radius ulnar pair, and a scattering of phalanges and thoracic vertebrae. But there was no pelvis, and neither were there any long bones below the femora, as the thigh bones, which were also entirely absent. Now, the hiker was right about the bones to an extent, because they appear to have been there for a very long time. Under the light of my LED beams, I could see the cortical bone was marred by fine vertical striations, which suggested decades of exposure to freezing winds. But then, the more I looked at it, the more something started to nag at me. When we found the skull, I took a good long look at it, and I was looking for gnaw marks from rodents or other tooth marks, which we call carnivore pitting, from large predators. But there was nothing but uniform periosteal stripping, which was way too clean to be weather damage. And this left only one plausible explanation. The flesh had been cut away from the bone by something very sharp. Now, I bagged a sample right there, a shard of bone used for our preliminary histology, which is the fancy term for putting something under a microscope. And once we made a mobile unit set up at the trailhead, we ran the sample under the portable FTIR spectrometer and then watched it as it lit up like a flare. There was a high amount of hydroxyapatite crystallinity, but the sample also exhibited some unusual thermal degradation signatures, which to me indicated sublethal heating at a temperature of around 170 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no charring, and what we were looking at wasn't any kind of regular diagenesis or decomposition, and that left only one feasible explanation. The bones had been boiled. After returning to the cave and continuing our analysis, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. We found a well-used enameled iron cooking pot at the rear of the cave. Traces of bone marrow residue clung to its interior, with its lipid profiles consistent with the same kind that comes from human femurs. High in oleic acid, low in polyunsaturated fats. The discovery of more bones proved that the defleshing had been anything but crude scavenging. It had been methodical. There were parallel incision marks on the ends of the bones, and judging by the microstriations, they'd been inflicted by some kind of carbon steel filleting knife, most likely complete with a serrated edge. And to the best of my judgment, I'd have to say the flesh had been removed immediately after death, before the bones were simmered to make a broth of tenderized marrow. There would be no logical reason to do this other than consumption, in which case, it made sense that the lower limbs were missing, as the medius cuts had most likely been hauled away for later. Now, in plain English, This wasn't the kind of survival cannibalism people were forced into on the Oregon Trail. It had been staged in isolation, most likely to evade prying eyes of rangers and hikers. This wasn't desperation. This was a feast. We had the remains airlifted to the Denver lab that afternoon, where a full post-mortem unfolded over the course of several weeks. Now, it took a while, but we heard the carbon dating on the sample we took pegged the year of death between 2003 and 2005. There was no corresponding dental records for the teeth that remained in the skull. The molars showed moderate damage, but there were no fillings or orthodontic work done, so my best guess involved being some kind of vagrant. Now, we extracted some degraded DNA and then ran it through the state's database, as well as CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and we got 0 hits. There were no familial matches, no cold case crossovers, nothing. And in terms of where the victim was from, enamel analysis hinted at a Midwestern upbringing. But in contrast to my theory that this person was a vagrant, the only thing that came up in the toxicology reports were trace caffeine metabolites. There was no indication of a struggle, no restraint artifacts on the wrists. Cause of death was most likely asphyxiation or blunt force, executed elsewhere, then transported to the karst cave for what I guess you might call the harvest. The case files have been archived for more than 6 years now, gathering digital dust in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's unsolved ledger. Now, the killer, who was most likely male considering the brute force required to do what he did, clean slipped the noose, so to speak, meaning somewhere out there in the sprawl of flyover country, or maybe in some tiny mountain town, there's a murderer and a cannibal breathing free air. I used to imagine it sometimes, his pot bubbling over with bone broth as he packaged up the better cuts. I can't forget it, and I know I never will. Because in this line of work, some fractures never heal. On the rare occasion that someone asks me what I do for a living, my reply always prompts the same response every single time. I say, I'm a limnologist. Then they say, what the heck is that? So, in as few words as possible, I'm a scientist, and I study freshwater, meaning anything from lakes to ponds to reservoirs, and my job is to understand how they work as ecosystems. I'll measure how deep they are, I'll check their chemical composition, as well as taking notes of what lives in them, and if applicable, how it all changes with the seasons. I guess I'm a nerd for water, but I love my job for another reason, and that's all the field work I get to do. I've always been happier outdoors than indoors, so the field work side of things was a big appeal when it came time to apply for jobs. I'm a regular visitor to national parks, but sometimes my work takes me out to some very remote places that are far from the beaten track. I'm talking lakes tucked away behind miles of logging roads, or ponds that are so deep in the backcountry that there's no cell service or gas station for miles and miles around. Now, once I arrive at my site, I'll haul my equipment from my truck, the depth sounders, water samplers, and oxygen probes, and then I'll take measurements of temperature and oxygen at different depths to build what we call a profile. It can be pretty lonely work, and obviously that has its own set of downsides. But then came one day when I learned that sometimes alone is better. So on the day in question, I had been out on the lake all morning pulling up sediment cores. These are really long, heavy cylinders full of mud from the lake's bottom, and analyzing them layer by layer can tell you the story of the lake's past. It was one of those remote southwestern lakes, Lake Walker in Nevada to be exact, where the road just kind of gives up points and turns into gravel. No one goes out there unless they've got a reason, and since there are a few good reasons to be out at some muddy lake in the middle of the desert, I thought I was alone. And by the time I got the last course sealed and logged, my arms felt like they were just about ready to fall off, and with the sun starting to dip behind the tree line, it signaled the end of my day's work. I sort of trudged back up the path to where I'd parked the truck. In it was my old field rig loaded with gear, data sheets, and a cooler full of samples. It was expensive gear too, so much so that it'd be cheaper to replace me than it would be my equipment. And so you can imagine my horror when I finally spotted my truck and saw that the driver's side window had been smashed in. I ran, convinced that some meth head had stolen tens of thousands of dollars worth of specialist equipment, and I could already see him flipping it for a few $100 and then smoking or injecting months of work into his lungs or veins. And then by the time I was terminated from my job, denied what I believed was my life's purpose, he'd already be robbing his next victim. I was catastrophizing, I suppose, these hypotheticals, panic-stricken at the idea of all that work amounting to nothing. But while I found a heck of a lot of glass all over the seats, there was nothing missing. In fact, rather than steal from me, whoever broke my window had only added things, not taken them away. Because underneath the windshield wiper, pinned in place by the plastic, was a torn scrap of cardboard on which was written, "We left you a gift." And by all estimates, my window had been broken by the fist-sized rock which now lay on the passenger's seat, and looking at it, I figured that was my gift. I distinctly remember being terrified that someone was about to step out of the nearby tree line, someone who'd been watching and waiting to give me more of their gifts. But thankfully there was no one. And then after sweeping all the broken glass from off my seat, I started on the long drive back to the dirt road that'd take me toward the highway. By the time I was moving again, I'd calmed down a little, but by then I was also just mad. I mean, who the hell sees a stranger's truck parked in the middle of nowhere and their first thought is, I'm gonna smash it? I figured it was probably just some dumb teenagers, bodies of men, the minds of children, with mile-wide cruel streaks to boot. And then as I considered the probability of the cops being able to catch them, I felt something moving against my leg. I thought maybe a fly might have gotten to the truck, so I sort of just jerked my leg a little to get it off of me. But the feeling didn't stop, and I realized that whatever it was way bigger than any fly. I then remember taking my eyes off the road and looking down at my leg, and that's when I saw what was crawling up it, and my heart nearly stopped in my chest. It was a bark scorpion, one of the most venomous in all of North America. That was my gift, not the rock, and despite my education and IQ, I hadn't realized until it was way too late. Every instinct told me to slam on the brakes and jump out, and try to bat it off my leg, but I was doing 60 down some winding road with one with no shoulder to speak of. I just remember gripping the wheel so hard that my hands hurt afterwards as I forced myself to breathe, and when they say that time slows down in those sorts of situations, I didn't know how true that really was until those moments. Each second stretched out like a rubber band as I watched that scorpion slowly crawl up my leg, and as each one slipped by, I watched the scorpion edge closer and closer to my groin. I managed to ease off the gas, signal and roll to a stop on a narrow gravel turnout. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest as I shifted into park, and then I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my doors smoothly and slowly as I could. I stepped out one leg at a time, and then after raising the fabric from off the skin of my thigh, so as if it sort of stung it would penetrate my skin, I began to shake my pants till the scorpion fell and hit the ground. I practically jumped back into my truck and slammed the door again, but when I did, I was hit by this wave of relief and spent the next few minutes with my head in my hands. I don't think that I've ever been so terrified in all my life, and to this day, I struggle to think of a time where I felt more panic-stricken. It wasn't even so much the scorpion, because while people have died after being stung by bark scorpions, those deaths are very rare. It was the idea of trying to keep my car on the road when my legs felt numb and I went into convulsions. Then if another truck or car drove by, and I might as well have finished that day in several more pieces than I started. I told the guys back at the office about what happened. I needed no encouragement to file a police report because God knows I didn't want whoever left that scorpion in my car to get away with it. But I also knew that there was a very slim chance anything would come out of it, so I wasn't surprised when months turned into a year and I didn't hear back from the cops in Nevada. To this day, I sometimes catch myself wondering who the hell would do something like that and why, but I think deep down, I know. My grandpa used to say some folks were born with the devil in them, and while I have a more scientific explanation, it doesn't make it any less digestible. Some people are just bad, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Ever since I can remember, I've always been into post-apocalyptic movies and TV shows. That's no exaggeration either. The first movie I ever remember watching was a Peter Graves one from the 70s called Where Have All the People Gone? It's about a mysterious natural disaster, a solar flash that turns like 90% of people into ash and leaves everyone else to wander this deserted, dead landscape. If I watched it nowadays, I'd probably think it was pretty lame, but back then, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I mean, Mad Max was awesome too, but the idea of people disappearing seemed like it'd be sort of strangely peaceful. Now cut to about 15 years later, and I don't have to look far to understand my fascination with abandoned places. And throughout the summer of 1996, me and my buddy Stan started ticking off as many Texas ghost towns as we possibly could. We visited Mesquite over in Borden County, and then we hit up Best and Reagan and Langley over in Valverde. We'd walk around, take pictures, drink a few beers, and then drive back home once we were back under the limit again. And you might think once you've seen one abandoned town, you've seen them all, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. Each one has something unique to offer. It's just that sometimes that thing isn't always good. So after Langley, me and Stan started looking up other places to visit. It wasn't easy back then. We didn't have access to the internet to just look these things up. So when Stan found a place, he called me up excited as hell and told me all about a little place called Lobo. Apparently water was found in the area back in the mid-1800s, and it became a watering hole for pioneers heading west. A railroad depot was established a few years later under the designation Lobo because of all the wolves that roamed around the area, and that's how the town got its name. By the late 20s, the town had almost 30 permanent residents, but more than 100 railroad workers that were stationed around the depot too. There was a hotel, a general store, and a bunch of other businesses. And then came the earthquake. Well, 2 earthquakes, and then the wells ran dry. Stan said that, and he swore this was no word of a lie, a guy called William Christ bought the whole place in the 60s. He opened up a general store and a gas station in the hopes of reviving the place and offered discounted rents to anyone who'd come live there. But then, weirdly enough, there was a weird kind of crime wave around Lobo, and then a bunch of Bill Christ businesses all burned down one night, and he abandoned the place. That was 1991. Meaning by 1996 the place had been abandoned for 5 years. But unlike a lot of other places, almost every building in Lobo was still standing. In fact, I'd say it was the most complete abandoned town we'd ever visited, and the closest I'd ever been to recreating the stuff I saw in Where Have All the People Gone. As you can imagine, I was absolutely over the moon, and so was Stan. It was like we'd walked straight onto the set of some post-apocalyptic survival movie. But little did we know, it was about to become part horror movie too. Because after walking around for no more than a few minutes, me and Stan had heard a sudden scream. It might sound dumb, but at the time, I looked at him and asked if he'd set it up. Like he'd, I don't know, paid someone to stop by and scare the crap out of me by unleashing some blood-curdling scream. But I turned to him, and the look of fear on his face told me all I needed to know. Since we'd heard Lobo was popular with urbex enthusiasts, some people who also appreciate abandoned places, we figured some other group had run into trouble, some obviously painful trouble by the sounds of things. So we did what we'd want anyone else to do if that was us in that situation, which was run to help. We ran in the direction of the screams, then as we got closer, we heard the sound of someone else cursing. I don't know about Stan, but I thought it sounded like whoever he was with trying to calm him down. He'd fallen, broken his leg, and his buddies telling him to keep quiet so he can concentrate. But it wasn't that at all. Stan yelled out, "Hang on, we're coming." At which point the person screaming started yelling, "Please help me," and all sorts of stuff. And we heard the other voice again too, and right away, I realized that we might have misjudged the situation. Something didn't sound right about the way that he was talking, but I could barely hear him over the screams. So I also didn't stop running because both me and Stan were still under the impression someone needed help. Well, they did. There was just no way that we could save them because the people making him scream found me and Stan before we could find the person needing saving. We didn't see the guy, we just saw some 6-foot monster wearing gloves and a crowbar, and then another guy, smaller, yelling at the bigger guy to get us. Now we turned on our heels and then sprinted all the way back to the car with that huge guy on our tail. But thanks to him being such a muffin, we were able to safely outrun him, and last time we saw him, he was in our rear view as we drove off. We called the cops from some gas station and drove with some deputy all the way back to where we'd been so he could see exactly what we were talking about. We didn't expect anyone to be there when we got back, and we were right on that. But what was left was a lot of blood. We think someone was being tortured. Maybe for information, maybe just revenge, and the people who orchestrated it were obviously some very shady people. If they were killing someone out there, they'd do it just before fleeing, right? So it had to be torture, and just writing that out gives me chills. It was the first time that we'd run into anything like that while touring some abandoned places, and while it wasn't the last, nothing ever quite compared to the insanity that happened that day in Lobo. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to watch your 6, 7.